The cabin was supposed to be an escape. I had been working nonstop for months, and my body and mind were begging for a break. A friend suggested a cabin deep in the woods, quiet, isolated, the perfect place to unwind. I thought it sounded ideal. A weekend with no phones, no emails, and no one else around. Just me, nature, and my thoughts. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It was beautiful, a small, rustic structure with a wraparound porch and a view of endless trees. The air smelled fresh, the kind of crisp scent that only comes from being far from civilization. I unloaded my car, carried my bags inside, and started to settle in. The interior was simple, a cozy living room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and one bedroom. Everything was clean and well-maintained, though there was something old about the place. It wasn't run down, just aged, like it held memories. I brushed the thought aside, lit a fire, and made myself a quick dinner. By the time I finished eating, the sun had disappeared behind the trees, and the forest outside was cloaked in darkness. That was when I first heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, so soft I thought I was imagining it. A low, indistinct murmuring that seemed to come from outside. I paused, holding my breath to listen. It stopped. Must be the wind, I told myself, though the air outside was still. I shook it off and went to bed, eager to start my relaxation weekend. But the whispering came back. I woke up sometime after midnight, heart pounding. Something had startled me awake, though I couldn't say what. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. Faint, barely audible, but undeniably there, voices whispering my name. Lila. The sound sent chills crawling up my spine. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more clearly. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Lila, come outside. My stomach twisted. I knew I should stay in bed, ignore the voices, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and tiptoed to the window. Peering through the glass, I saw nothing but darkness. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone outside. I turned off the flashlight and pressed my ear to the window. The whispers were still there, coming from the woods. Lila were waiting. My breath hitched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there watching me. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one before returning to bed. It took hours for me to fall asleep, and when I did, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures lurking in the trees. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe the isolation was playing tricks on me. I spent the day hiking the trails around the cabin, trying to distract myself. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, sunlight filtering through the leaves, birds singing in the distance. For a while, I almost forgot about the whispers. But as the sun began to set, I started to feel uneasy. The shadows stretched longer, and the air grew heavy. By the time I got back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. Lila, come outside. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets tightly. I refused to move, refused to look. But the voices didn't stop. Lila, we see you. A loud knock on the window made me scream. My flashlight was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, shining the beam toward the window. There was nothing there. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to pack up and leave, cut the trip short. But as I stepped outside to load my car, I stopped dead in my tracks. The ground around the cabin was covered in small wooden figures. They were crude carvings, each one shaped like a person. Some were missing limbs, others had exaggerated features, but they all had one thing in common: they looked like me. The hair, the clothes, even the way I stood. I felt sick. My legs wobbled beneath me as I stepped closer to one of the figures. The details were uncanny. How had someone made these without me noticing? I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me. Lila. The whisper was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the figures, scattered across the ground. I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, bolting the windows for good measure. My phone had no signal, but I tried calling for help anyway. Nothing. The whispers grew louder as the day went on, filling the cabin like a chorus of voices. They were relentless, repeating my name over and over, urging me to come outside. By nightfall, I was a wreck. My head throbbed, my nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was losing my mind. The whispering was constant now, a low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I didn't dare look outside, but I could feel them out there, watching, waiting. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to find the wooden figures were gone. The ground was clear, as if they had never been there at all. I didn't waste any time. I threw my bags into the car and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away from the cabin. Even now, back in the safety of my home, I can still hear the whispers sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet, they come back. Lila, we're waiting. I don't know who or what they were, but I know this. I'll never go back to that cabin in the woods. I rented the cabin for a weekend of peace and quiet. Life had been overwhelming lately, and I needed to get away from everything: work, people, and the endless noise of the city. The cabin, tucked deep in the woods, promised solitude. I arrived late in the afternoon. The trees surrounding the cabin were tall and dense, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. The structure itself was small but charming, with wooden walls and a stone chimney. The owner had left the key in a small lockbox near the door, just as promised. Inside, it was cozy: one large room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a small bedroom off to the side. The cabin was rustic but clean, with a stack of wood ready by the fireplace and thick blankets folded neatly on the couch. It felt like the perfect escape. After unpacking, I made myself some tea and settled on the couch with a book. The forest outside was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. As the sun set, the shadows in the cabin grew longer, and the silence started to feel a little heavy. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I wasn't used to this kind of stillness. I decided to call it a night. The first night passed without incident. I slept well and woke up feeling refreshed. After breakfast, I went for a long walk through the woods. The air was crisp and cool, and the forest was beautiful in the daylight. I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. A book was lying on the floor near the couch. I didn't remember leaving it there. It wasn't the book I had been reading the night before. It was old, with a worn leather cover and yellowed pages. Curious, I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting, messy and uneven. It looked like a journal. The first entry read, "I've been here for 3 days now. I thought this place would be peaceful, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. Sometimes I hear noises at night, footsteps, whispers. I keep telling myself it's nothing, but I don't believe it." I felt a chill run down my spine. Who had written this? Was it a guest who had stayed here before me? Or something else? I flipped through the journal. Most of the entries were short, describing small, unsettling events. Strange noises, objects being moved, a sense of being watched. Then, toward the end, the tone changed. The writing became frantic, the words scrawled across the page in uneven lines. "They know I'm here. They're watching me. I can't leave. They won't let me leave." The final entry was just one word, repeated over and over: "Help." I closed the journal and set it on the table, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a story, I told myself. Someone trying to scare future guests. Maybe it was even left there on purpose, part of some weird joke. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I heard footsteps. It started just after midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a faint creak coming from the living room. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then it came again. Another creak, louder this time. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable now, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the wooden floor. My heart raced. Someone was in the cabin. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, holding it tightly as I crept out of the bedroom. The living room was empty, the front door locked. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. I checked every corner of the cabin, even the small bathroom and the closet. There was no one there. But as I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The journal, which I had left on the table, was now lying on the floor. The next day, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe I had knocked the journal off the table without realizing it. Maybe the footsteps were just the cabin settling. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I spent the day outside, hiking farther into the woods to avoid being inside the cabin. The forest felt safer somehow, even with its eerie silence. When I returned in the late afternoon, I found something new waiting for me. The journal was open on the table, turned to a blank page. But it wasn't blank anymore. Scrawled across the page, in the same messy handwriting as the earlier entries, was a single sentence. "Don't look upstairs." A chill swept through me. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. Upstairs? There was no upstairs. The cabin was a single-story structure. Unless, my eyes moved to the ceiling. There it was, almost invisible in the dim light, a trapdoor leading to an attic. I hadn't noticed it before, and now I wished I hadn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept staring at the trapdoor, half expecting it to open on its own. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, heavier. They moved across the living room and stopped directly below the trapdoor. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The cabin was silent again, but I could feel something. Someone, standing just out of sight. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Then slowly, the trapdoor began to creak open. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear. A face appeared in the opening, pale and ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. It didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, it said, "Help me." I don't remember much of what happened after that. Somehow, I found the strength to run. I grabbed my car keys and bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until I was miles down the road. The owner seemed surprised when I called to tell him I was leaving early. He didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. I don't know who or what was in that cabin, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back. Even now, weeks later, I can't get the face out of my mind. Those hollow eyes, the desperate whisper. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear it. Help me. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from the city and its constant noise. I needed this break. Life had become overwhelming, and I wanted nothing more than to spend a few days alone in nature. The cabin seemed perfect, simple, quiet, and surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how peaceful it was. The forest stretched out endlessly in every direction, the kind of place where you could lose yourself for hours. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with wooden walls, a fireplace, and large windows that let in the golden glow of the late afternoon sun. I carried my bags inside and started to explore. The living room was inviting, with a plush couch and a stack of firewood ready for use. The kitchen was tiny but functional, with an old-fashioned stove and a table for two. The bedroom was just big enough for a bed and a small dresser. Everything felt right, except for the door. It was in the basement. I found it while looking around after settling in. The basement was small and dimly lit, with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There wasn't much down there, just a few shelves with some tools, a dusty old chair, and that door. It was red, bright, and glossy, standing out against the gray concrete walls. Unlike the rest of the cabin, which felt rustic and natural, the door looked almost new. It had a sturdy padlock hanging from a metal latch, and there was no key in sight. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just storage, I told myself. Still, there was something unsettling about it. The door didn't belong in a place like this. I went back upstairs, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It was probably nothing, just my overactive imagination. I lit a fire in the fireplace, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on the couch with a book. The cabin was warm and inviting, and soon, I had almost forgotten about the red door. But that night, I heard the growling. It started just as I was drifting off to sleep. A low, guttural sound, faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was an animal outside. Bears or coyotes, maybe. But as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. The sound was coming from below, from the basement. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The growling was steady, rhythmic, almost like it was breathing. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept to the basement door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The growling grew louder with each step, echoing off the cold concrete walls. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The red door was shaking. It wasn't a violent shaking, more like a steady vibration, as if something behind it was pushing against it, testing the lock. The growling grew louder, almost like a warning. I stood there, paralyzed with fear. My flashlight beam trembled as I shone it on the door. I wanted to run, to go back upstairs and pretend I hadn't seen or heard anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door, my hands trembling. The padlock was still secure, but the door itself seemed to pulse, almost like it was alive. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The growling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a loud thud shook the door, making me stumble back. I ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with questions. What was behind that door? The next day, I tried to act like everything was normal. I went for a hike, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The forest was quiet and serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The padlock on the red door was gone. I didn't want to go back into the basement, but I had to know what was happening. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I descended the stairs once more. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. The growling was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. Every instinct told me to leave, to run, but I couldn't turn away. Slowly, I pushed the door open. Beyond the door was a tunnel, long and dark, stretching farther than my flashlight could reach. The walls were made of rough stone, damp and cold to the touch. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the chilly air. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning like a labyrinth. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I don't know how long I walked before I saw it, an alcove carved into the stone wall. Inside was a small wooden box, old and weathered. I opened the box, and inside was a collection of photographs. They were pictures of people, men, women, children, all standing in front of the cabin. Some of the photos were recent, while others looked decades old. The faces were smiling, but their eyes looked hollow, almost lifeless. At the bottom of the box was a single note, written in shaky handwriting. "Don't trust the door. It doesn't lead out." I ran back to the cabin, my mind racing. Who were the people in the photos? And what did the note mean? That night, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Around midnight, I heard the growling again. This time, it was louder, deeper, and it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from outside. I peeked through the window and saw shadows moving among the trees. They weren't animals. They were tall, lanky figures, their limbs too long, their movements too jerky. One of them stopped and turned toward the cabin. Even in the darkness, I could see its face, or lack of one. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface where its features should have been. It began to move toward the cabin, its long fingers clawing at the air. I ran to the basement, my only thought being to hide. The red door was still open, the tunnel stretching out before me. Without thinking, I stepped inside and slammed the door shut behind me. I don't know how long I wandered in the tunnel. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker. Eventually, I came to another door, identical to the first one. When I opened it, I was back in the cabin. Everything looked the same, the furniture, the fireplace, even my bags sitting by the door. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The shadows seemed darker, the silence louder. And then I saw them. The figures were standing outside the windows, their pale faces pressed against the glass. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stared. I don't know how I escaped. The next thing I remember, I was in my car, speeding down the dirt road. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know what was behind the red door, or where the tunnel really led. But sometimes late at night, I hear the growling again, and I wonder if I ever really left. The cabin was a dream come true. After years of saving and planning, I had finally purchased a small, secluded getaway deep in the woods. It was perfect, a place to escape the noise of the city and unwind in peace. The day I moved in was bright and sunny, the forest alive with birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace, warm wooden walls, and big windows that let in plenty of natural light. It felt like home the moment I walked in. But there was one odd thing. The previous owner had left in a hurry. The furniture was still there, covered with white sheets, and boxes of random belongings were stacked in the corners. When I asked the realtor about it, she shrugged and said, he didn't want to talk about it. He just wanted to sell quickly. At the time, I didn't think much of it. People move for all kinds of reasons. I figured he had his own issues to deal with and was glad to leave. I spent the first day cleaning and unpacking, humming to myself as I worked. By evening, the cabin looked cozy and inviting. I lit a fire, made a cup of tea, and settled into the old armchair near the hearth. That's when I heard it, the voice. At first, I thought it was the wind. The sound was faint, like a whisper carried through the walls. I tilted my head, listening. Hello. It was so soft, I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked around the cabin, trying to find the source. The voice came again, louder this time. Is someone there? It was coming from the wall near the fireplace. I pressed my ear to the wood, my breath shallow. The voice was faint but clear, a woman's voice, trembling and desperate. Please help me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of joke, right? Maybe the previous owner had installed some weird speaker system as a prank. But the voice didn't sound like a recording. It sounded real. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I heard her again, calling out from the walls. Don't leave me here. Why won't you help me? I told myself it was just the stress of the move, my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I searched every inch of the cabin, looking for speakers or hidden devices that could explain the voice. I even checked outside, walking around the perimeter of the cabin to see if there was anything unusual. Nothing. The walls were solid wood, the kind that wouldn't hide wires or speakers. There were no vents or ducts where sound could travel. It didn't make sense. As the day went on, I tried to ignore the voice, but it was relentless. It spoke in whispers and sobs, begging for help, pleading for me to listen. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer and chisel and started prying at the wall near the fireplace. The wood came away in chunks, revealing old insulation and the studs beneath. At first, there was nothing unusual, just layers of dust and cobwebs. But then, as I pulled away another piece of wood, I saw it, a small compartment built into the wall. Inside was a bundle of cloth, tied tightly with string. My hands shook as I pulled it out and untied the knot. The cloth fell away, revealing a small notebook and a locket. The notebook was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting inside was neat but rushed, as if written in a hurry. If you're reading this, please help me. My name is Eleanor. I've been trapped here for so long, I don't know how much time has passed. He won't let me leave. He says the cabin belongs to him, and so do I. My breath caught in my throat. I've tried to escape, but he always finds me. He whispers through the walls, watches me through the windows. I can't hide from him. If you find this, please don't ignore it. Burn the cabin. Destroy it. It's the only way to end this. The rest of the notebook was filled with frantic scribbles, words scrawled over each other. Trapped. Watched. Burn it. I opened the locket. Inside was a small photograph of a young woman with dark hair and sad eyes. Her face was familiar. It was the face I had imagined when I heard the voice. That night, the whispers changed. They weren't pleading anymore. They were angry. Why did you open it? You shouldn't have found it. Now you can't leave. The voice echoed through the cabin, louder than before, filling every corner of the small space. I tried to ignore it, huddling under the blankets like a child, but the voice wouldn't stop. You should have listened. Now it's too late. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke to the sound of something scratching at the walls. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. The fire in the hearth had burned out, leaving the cabin cold and dark. I reached for my flashlight, but the beam only revealed more shadows. The scratching grew louder, closer. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I saw it. A face pressed against the window, pale and distorted. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was twisted into a horrible grin. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me. I froze, unable to look away. The thing outside raised a hand and tapped on the glass, its nails clicking softly. And then, in a voice that sounded like Eleanor's but wasn't, it whispered, "Let me in." I don't remember how I got through the night. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, the whispers stopped, and the figure was gone. I packed my things as quickly as I could, throwing everything into the car without caring if I forgot something. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The front door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. And in the doorway, I saw her. Eleanor stood there, her sad eyes watching me. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just watched as I drove away. I never went back to that cabin. I told the realtor to sell it, to give it to someone else. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to forget. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the voice. It whispers through the walls of my apartment, soft and pleading. Help me. Don't leave me here. I don't know if it's Eleanor or the thing that kept her trapped. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to the woods. I had always wanted a break from the chaos of my life. The noise, the pressure, the constant rush. It was exhausting. So, when I found a small, isolated cabin in the woods, I couldn't resist. It was the perfect place to recharge, to clear my mind and reconnect with nature. The cabin was a quaint little building, tucked away in the heart of a dense forest. It was old but well kept, with a wooden exterior that blended seamlessly with the trees around it. There was a small porch with a couple of chairs, a stone fireplace in the living room, and a cozy loft upstairs. It was small, simple, and had everything I needed for a peaceful stay. I arrived in the late afternoon, and the air smelled fresh and crisp. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the trees. I unloaded my bags, set up a fire in the hearth, and made myself a cup of tea. The cabin felt like the perfect escape. I spent the first evening just relaxing, reading a book by the fire, and enjoying the peace and quiet. There was no rush, no deadlines, no distractions. It was exactly what I needed. But then, on my second day, I found the mirror. It was in the upstairs loft, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. At first, I thought it was just another piece of forgotten furniture. But when I pulled it out from the corner, I realized it was something else entirely. The mirror was large, with a heavy, ornate frame made of dark wood. It looked ancient, like it had been sitting there for decades, maybe longer. The glass was cloudy and scratched, the surface rippling slightly as I stared into it. I wasn't sure why, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. I considered leaving it there, but then I thought, why not clean it up? After all, it was a beautiful piece, and it could add a nice touch to the cabin. I carefully moved it into the living room, propping it up against the wall. As I wiped the dust from the glass, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. The reflection in the mirror seemed off, like it wasn't quite right. The cabin behind me looked slightly distorted, the colors swirling in a way that didn't make sense. Shaking it off as just my imagination, I hung the mirror on the wall above the fireplace and went about my day. That night, as I sat by the fire, the unease I had felt earlier began to return. It wasn't just the mirror. I was starting to feel like something wasn't right with the cabin itself. The air felt heavier, thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But when I glanced at the mirror, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The reflection wasn't showing the cabin as it was. It was like looking at a different version of the room, darker, colder, and more distorted. The walls seemed to bend in unnatural ways, and the shadows cast by the fire flickered and moved in odd patterns. I turned to look behind me, but everything in the room was normal. I rubbed my eyes and took a deep breath. I was just tired, that was all. I had been working too hard lately, and the isolation was starting to mess with my mind. I stood up, walked over to the mirror, and gave it one last look. The reflection of me was there, but it was different. My face seemed more pale, my eyes darker, and my expression off. It wasn't a reflection I recognized. I quickly turned away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to leave the room. I grabbed my coat, went outside, and took a walk in the woods to clear my head. The cold air helped, and after an hour or so, I felt a bit better. But as I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the image of the mirror. It was like it was calling to me, pulling me back. The next day, I tried to act normal. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the reflection was due to the old glass. I decided to stay busy, go for a hike, cook some meals, and enjoy the fresh air. But as night fell, I couldn't escape the feeling of unease. The cabin seemed darker, quieter. Even the trees outside looked like they were pressing in on me, their bare branches scratching against the windows. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, but I couldn't shake the pull of the mirror. I knew I shouldn't go near it, but I had to see it again. I reluctantly stood up and walked over to the wall. The reflection was waiting for me. This time, it was worse. In the mirror, I saw myself standing by the fire. But something wasn't right. I wasn't standing in the same spot. The reflection showed me farther into the room, closer to the door, as if I had moved without realizing it. I reached out to touch the mirror, my fingers trembling. When I did, I felt a jolt of cold that shot through my arm and into my chest. I pulled my hand back, my heart racing. I tried to step away, but my reflection didn't move. It was staring at me. For a moment, I couldn't move. It felt like the reflection was alive, like it was a separate entity that could see me and was waiting for something. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange thoughts that were clouding my mind. But when I looked again, the reflection had changed. Now my reflection was smiling, an eerie, unnatural grin that stretched across my face. My eyes were wide, too wide, and they gleamed with something that wasn't me. I stepped back, gasping for air. What was happening? Why was it doing this? The next few days were a blur of strange events. Every time I looked into the mirror, the reflection grew more and more distorted. It was like I was losing control of my own image, as if the mirror was showing me someone or something else. One morning, I woke up and found that the reflection in the mirror wasn't even mine at all. It was a figure, a tall, thin man with dark hair, standing in the same position I had been just moments before. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, packed up, and prepared to leave. I was done with the cabin, done with the mirror. But as I reached for the door, I stopped. The mirror was calling to me again, pulling me back into the room. I turned around, against my better judgment, and walked back to the mirror one last time. I don't know why I did it. I should have left. But something inside me needed to see what would happen. As I stared into the glass, my reflection grinned again, this time more widely than before. The figure in the mirror started to move, walking toward the edge of the frame, closer and closer to the glass. I backed away, but it didn't matter. The reflection reached out, its fingers pressing against the glass. I felt a cold, sharp pressure on my chest, as if the reflection was trying to pull me in. With all my strength, I slammed my hand against the mirror, shattering it into pieces. The room was silent, save for the sound of the glass crunching beneath my feet. I left the cabin that day and never looked back. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with what had happened. I don't know what the mirror was, or why it had such a hold on me. But I know one thing, I will never return to that cabin again, and I will never forget the reflection that wasn't mine. I had been looking for an escape for a long time. After months of stressful work, endless meetings, and the constant noise of the city, I needed to get away. The idea of a quiet, peaceful retreat in the woods sounded perfect. So, when I found a cabin that was available for rent, I didn't hesitate for a second. The place was deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. The cabin itself was simple, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a small loft. It was exactly what I needed, isolated and quiet. I could already imagine spending the weekend in front of the fire, reading, and letting my mind relax. I drove up on Friday afternoon, just as the sky began to cloud over. The weather was starting to change, but I didn't think much of it. A little rain wouldn't ruin my weekend. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. The air was fresh and clean, the trees tall and ancient. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant call of birds. The perfect place to unwind. The cabin was just as I imagined, charming and cozy. The firewood was stacked neatly by the door, and the inside was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen, a large dining table, and a comfy couch by the fireplace. I immediately felt at home. I started a fire, unpacked my things, and made myself a cup of tea. As the evening wore on, I settled into the cabin's cozy atmosphere. The storm outside began to pick up, with the wind howling through the trees and rain hitting the roof with a soft patter. I didn't mind the storm. If anything, it added to the feeling of being completely cut off from the outside world. But as the night grew darker, something started to feel off. It began with a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as the sound grew louder, I realized it was something else. There was a soft thudding sound coming from somewhere inside the cabin. It wasn't a rhythmic sound like footsteps, but more like something tapping on the walls. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The cabin was old, and the wood creaked and groaned in the wind. But then, the sound came again. This time, it was louder, more urgent, like something or someone was tapping desperately at the walls. I stood up from the couch, my heart racing. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. Just the sound of rain hitting the windows and the howling wind. I walked around the cabin, checking every room. Everything was quiet still. The cabin was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. I returned to the living room and sat down, my mind racing. The tapping had stopped again, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself down. It was probably just the storm, the wind playing tricks on the old house. I made another cup of tea and sat back down, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled over me. The storm raged outside, but it wasn't just the storm that made me uneasy. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't the tapping anymore. It was something worse. Every time I glanced around the room, I felt like I was being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, and the firelight flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I stood up again and checked all the windows. Everything was locked, secure. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was outside. I even stepped outside onto the porch for a moment, the cold air hitting my face, but the storm had picked up even more. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain poured down in sheets. Nothing seemed out of place. I returned inside, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the book was a blur in my hands. And then I heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper. It wasn't coming from the walls, though. It was coming from outside the cabin. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain. The storm outside was wild, the trees whipping in the wind. But there, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. I gasped, my heart skipping a beat. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. They were standing still, staring at the cabin. But it was impossible to make out any details, just a vague silhouette in the storm. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The wind slammed against me, and the rain soaked me in an instant, but I pushed forward, shining the beam of light into the darkness. The figure was gone. I searched the area around the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the rain and darkness, but I found nothing. No sign of a person, no footprints, nothing. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was just a trick of the storm. I returned inside, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking. I couldn't understand what had just happened. But one thing was certain, I wasn't alone. The storm continued through the night, but the tapping sound never returned. The figure outside was gone, and for a brief moment, I felt like I could relax again. But then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it, a loud bang coming from the attic. I jumped up, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight again, my mind racing. What was that? I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the attic door. The cabin felt colder now, the air thick with tension. I didn't want to go up there, but I had to know what was making the noise. With a deep breath, I opened the door and climbed the creaky stairs to the attic. The light flickered as I reached the top, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the room, looking for anything unusual. At first, everything seemed normal, old furniture, boxes, and some dusty items left behind by the previous owner. But then, I noticed something strange. In the far corner of the attic, there was a large wooden chest. It hadn't been there when I first arrived. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. The chest was old, covered in dust and cobwebs. The hinges were rusty, but it looked like it had been opened recently. I reached out, my hand trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside, there was a pile of old clothes, but beneath them, something else, something that made my stomach turn. A hand, a severed hand, pale and lifeless, resting at the bottom of the chest. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The room spun around me as panic set in. What had I found? Why was it here? I ran down the stairs, not looking back, and slammed the attic door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my body trembling with fear. I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. I grabbed my things in a panic, my hands shaking as I tried to gather my belongings. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to leave. As I rushed out the door and into my car, the storm raged on, the wind howling like some monstrous creature in the night. I didn't look back as I drove away, the cabin disappearing behind me in the rain and darkness. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. I didn't know what was real anymore, what I had imagined, and what had actually happened. But one thing was certain, I would never go back to that cabin in the storm. The forest, the cabin, the hand in the chest, it was all too much. I had to leave it behind, and I never looked back. I had always wanted to spend some time in a remote cabin, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. After months of stressful work and endless commitments, I decided it was time for a break. A weekend in a cabin by a lake deep in the woods, just me, the peaceful nature, and no distractions. I rented the cabin through a website and got everything arranged. I had no idea what I was walking into. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town, and the drive out there was as peaceful as I had imagined. The road became smaller as I got farther away from civilization, winding through thick trees and up small hills. The landscape was beautiful, and everything felt quiet and calm. As I approached the cabin, it stood alone beside the lake, surrounded by tall trees and a few shrubs. The lake itself was a deep shade of blue, its surface still and untouched. The cabin looked old, but charming, just what I had hoped for. It was a simple, rustic building made of wood with a stone chimney. There was a porch with a couple of chairs, and inside, everything looked exactly like what I imagined. A fireplace, a cozy sofa, a small kitchen, and a big window that looked out over the lake. After I unpacked my things, I made myself at home. I started a fire in the fireplace, unpacked a book I had been meaning to read, and enjoyed a warm cup of tea. The first few hours were perfect. The silence of the place was unlike anything I had experienced in a long time. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere started to change. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. The stillness of the lake turned into an eerie quiet, as if something was waiting. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then I heard it. A soft sound, like a splash in the lake. I stood up, puzzled. I hadn't seen anyone around when I arrived, and there didn't seem to be any boats on the water. I looked out the window, but the lake was still. The surface was perfectly smooth. I tried to ignore it, thinking it must have been a fish or some other animal. But as the evening went on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Night fell, and the cabin became darker. The fire in the fireplace crackled, but the air inside felt heavy, as if something was lurking in the shadows. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing strange noises, scratching sounds on the walls, creaks from the floorboards, and the faintest whispers on the wind. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, the wind, or some animal outside. But the longer I lay there, the more unsettled I felt. The whispers were growing louder, almost like a conversation, but I couldn't understand what was being said. My heart raced as I tried to shake off the feeling. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. Who could it be? I was miles away from the nearest neighbor. I wasn't expecting anyone. Tentatively, I got out of bed and walked toward the door, my mind racing. As I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. What if it was someone playing a prank? Or something worse? But before I could even touch the handle, the knock came again, this time louder and more urgent. "Hello." I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. My breath felt like ice in my chest. Who would come all the way out here? Was I imagining things? I opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. The porch was empty, the darkness stretching out before me, the only sound the occasional rustle of the trees. I stepped outside, scanning the area, but there was nothing. I was alone. I locked the door and went back inside, my heart still pounding. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, maybe the wind or some other sound that had startled me. But then, just as I was about to settle down again, I heard it once more. A splash. It came from the lake. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds singing and the soft light of the rising sun coming through the window. The air was crisp and fresh, and for a brief moment, I thought that the strange happenings from the night before were nothing more than a bad dream. I decided to go for a walk around the lake to clear my head. The water was still, and the surrounding trees reflected perfectly on the surface. As I walked, I kept thinking about the strange noises. The knocks, the splash in the water, it didn't add up. I decided to take a closer look at the lake, maybe try to find out where the splash had come from. I walked along the shore, scanning the water, but I didn't see anything. That's when I noticed something strange, footprints in the mud near the edge of the lake. They were large, too large to be mine, and they seemed fresh. I stopped and stared at them. The footprints led from the water's edge, back into the woods. I had no idea who could have made them, but something about it made my skin crawl. I followed the trail for a little while, but it only seemed to go deeper into the woods. The further I walked, the more uncomfortable I felt. The trees were thick here, blocking out most of the light. The air grew heavier, and the quiet became unnerving. I felt like I was being watched. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling uneasy, but not wanting to admit it. I didn't want to be out here alone in the woods, following mysterious footprints. When I got back to the cabin, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But the unease didn't leave. The shadows seemed to be darker in the corners of the rooms, and the whispers from last night returned. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. I started the fire again and sat down, trying to distract myself with a book. But I couldn't focus. I kept hearing the whispers, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. That night, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more persistent. It came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen window. I stood frozen, listening, my heart racing. The knocks were rhythmic now, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know what to do. Slowly, I walked toward the kitchen, trying to keep my steps quiet. When I reached the window, I hesitated. Should I look? What if there was someone out there? What if it was something worse? But curiosity got the best of me. I slowly pulled the curtain back. There was no one outside. But the footprints, those same large footprints, were visible in the dirt near the window. They led from the edge of the porch up to the cabin, but this time they stopped right at the kitchen window. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who had been out there? What did they want? I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't feel safe here anymore. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I had to leave, but as I packed up my things, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. I felt my heart skip a beat as I checked the rest of the cabin. Everything seemed untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I quickly finished packing and headed for the car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The drive back felt like an eternity, and I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I tried to put the experience out of my mind, but it lingered. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the footprints, the knock on the door, and the whispers. I never told anyone about what happened at that cabin. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin by the lake, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful retreat. I had planned it for months, looking forward to the time away from the hustle of everyday life. A few days in a small cabin in the woods to escape, clear my mind, and relax. It had been a hectic few weeks, and I thought that the calm surroundings would help me reset. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town or any sign of civilization. It was an old, simple place, built from weathered wood and tucked in among the towering trees. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place that had been standing for decades, maybe longer. The windows were small, the roof steep, and there was a small porch with a rocking chair. I rented the cabin for the weekend. No cell service, no internet, just me and the nature around me. The drive there had been peaceful, with only the occasional car passing by on the winding, narrow roads. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was exactly what I needed. The inside of the cabin was just as simple, nothing fancy, but comfortable. A fireplace stood at one end of the living room, and a few old chairs were arranged around it. There was a small kitchen with just the basics: a stove, a refrigerator, a sink. Upstairs, there was a loft with a bed and a small window that looked out over the forest. I was excited to spend the evening by the fire, reading a book and sipping a hot cup of tea. The first few hours were perfect. The only sound I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees outside. It was calm, peaceful, exactly what I had been hoping for. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It began subtly, almost like a shift in the air around me. At first, I didn't notice it. I was too absorbed in my book, enjoying the quiet, the warmth of the fire. But then, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it. It was as if the space around me had changed. The room felt darker, despite the light from the fire. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out unnaturally. I shook my head and tried to dismiss the feeling. It was just the isolation, the silence, making my mind play tricks on me. Then I heard it, a soft whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind outside. Maybe the trees were swaying against the cabin, making strange sounds. But as the whispering continued, I realized it was coming from somewhere inside the house. I froze. My heart raced, and my breath caught in my throat. The whisper was too soft to make out, but it was definitely there. I stood up and walked around the cabin, checking every room, but there was no one else there. The whispering stopped for a moment, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But then it started again, this time closer, right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. No response, just silence, followed by the soft crackling of the fire. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I hearing things? Was I imagining it? It was so easy to convince myself that it was nothing, just the cabin settling, the wind playing tricks on me. But the whispers seemed too clear to ignore. I decided to go outside for a moment. I needed some fresh air to clear my head. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the silence had gotten to me. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air hit me, and I took a deep breath. The storm clouds that had been gathering earlier were now overhead, blocking out the stars. It was dark, almost too dark. The only light was the soft glow from the cabin's windows. The woods around me were silent, too silent. Not a single animal made a sound. The only thing I could hear was the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden structure. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself, before I turned to go back inside. But as I reached for the door, I heard something behind me. A movement. I spun around, my heart racing. There was nothing there, just the trees stretching out into the darkness. But then I saw something, just for a second. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, and for a moment, I thought I saw a faint shape moving toward the cabin. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I quickly stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The whispers continued off and on, always just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes they sounded like words, sometimes like distant laughter, but each time they were followed by a feeling of dread, like something was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. I even turned on the TV, though there was no signal. The soft static made the room feel colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with every passing minute. At some point, I drifted off to sleep on the couch, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me to fall asleep. The next day, I decided to go for a hike in the woods. Maybe getting out into the open air would help clear my mind. The sun was out, and the storm clouds had moved on, leaving only the occasional cloud in the sky. The air was fresh, and the sound of birds filled the air. But as I walked deeper into the forest, I started to feel uneasy again. The trees were thicker here, blocking out much of the sunlight, and the path seemed to wind in strange ways. It was like I was walking in circles, though I was certain I hadn't passed this spot before. I stopped and looked around. Everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind seemed to have died down. That's when I saw it. A shadow, moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, but a person, tall, dark, and moving swiftly between the trunks. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The figure was real. I called out, "Hello," but the figure didn't respond. It just kept moving, slipping further into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Should I follow it, or should I turn back? I wasn't sure, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Something told me I shouldn't follow it, but I didn't feel safe walking back alone either. I decided to head back to the cabin. The figure had disappeared into the trees, and I couldn't find any trace of it. I hurried back along the path, my steps quickening as the trees seemed to close in around me. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm myself. That night, the whispers were louder. They were no longer just soft sounds in the distance. They were right there, in the room with me. It was like they were coming from every corner, from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. I couldn't escape them. I sat frozen on the couch, my hands shaking. I could hear the whispers clearly now. They were calling my name. "Come outside," they whispered. "Follow us." I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't work. I tried to move, to get up and leave, but I felt like something was holding me down. The shadows in the room were moving. I could see them stretching and twisting in unnatural ways, as if they were alive. They seemed to reach for me, clawing at the air, trying to pull me into them. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but the whispers only grew louder. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, and the shadows were circling closer. In a panic, I grabbed my things, rushing toward the door. But when I turned the handle, it wouldn't open. The door was locked, but I hadn't locked it. I looked around, desperate, and that's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing just beyond the window, its face obscured by the darkness. But I could feel its eyes on me, watching me, waiting for me. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I ran. I didn't stop to grab anything else. I didn't even care about my bag or my phone. I just ran out the door into the woods, not looking back. The last thing I heard before I ran into the trees was the whisper. "You can never leave." I never went back to that cabin. I don't know what happened there, or what I saw in the woods. All I know is that I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it's still waiting for me, and I never want to go back to find out. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. A small cabin tucked away in the woods, far from the noise of the city. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, eager for a break from my busy life. Work had been overwhelming, and I needed time to myself to relax, reflect, and get away from all the stress. So when I found this cabin online, I booked it immediately. It looked so cozy, with a big porch, a fireplace, and surrounded by trees. The kind of place where I could unplug and recharge. The cabin was located near a small, remote lake, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. The drive there was long, but the journey itself was calm and peaceful. I drove through winding roads, past thick forests, and around small hills, the quiet of the countryside lulling me into a sense of calm. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was setting, and the air was crisp with the early evening chill. The cabin was just as I had imagined it. It was small, made of old wood, with a chimney puffing a thin stream of smoke into the sky. There was a small porch at the front with 2 rocking chairs, and a little stone path leading up to the door. I could already tell that this was going to be a peaceful place. I was excited to unpack my things and get comfortable. The interior of the cabin was rustic, but charming. The main room had a large stone fireplace, a cozy armchair, and a wooden table. The kitchen was simple but functional, with a stove, a small refrigerator, and a sink. Upstairs was a loft bedroom, with a window that looked out over the lake. It was exactly what I needed, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by nature. After settling in, I decided to take a short walk around the cabin and explore the area. The trees surrounding the cabin were tall, and the leaves were just beginning to change color, hinting at the arrival of fall. The lake shimmered in the fading light of the sun. I could hear the gentle lapping of the water against the shore, and the distant call of birds. It felt like the world had slowed down, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I went inside, started a fire, and made myself a cup of tea. I planned to spend the evening reading a book and enjoying the warmth of the fire. But as the night grew darker, I began to feel an odd sense of unease. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the quietness of the place, but the feeling lingered. I settled into the armchair by the fire and tried to focus on my book, but the silence felt heavy. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, and every once in a while, I thought I heard a faint noise from outside, like something moving in the woods. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The silence outside was deep, and the air had grown colder. I climbed the stairs to the loft and crawled into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing strange sounds, scratching noises on the walls, like something was trying to get inside. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the house settling. but the sounds continued. Then, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine, a faint knock on the door. I sat up in bed, wide-eyed and frozen. Who could be knocking at this hour? The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest house. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no other sound. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it had just been my imagination. Maybe it was a branch tapping against the door, or an animal. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but I couldn't. I lay back down and tried to sleep, but the rest of the night was restless, and I barely slept at all. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. The sun was just starting to rise, casting soft golden light across the cabin. I tried to ignore the strange events from the night before, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I got up, made some breakfast, and decided to go for a walk around the lake to clear my head. As I walked along the shore, I tried to focus on the beauty of the surroundings, the crisp air, the rustling of the leaves, and the peaceful stillness of the water. But as I walked, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the soft mud near the edge of the lake. They were large, heavy prints, as if someone had been walking along the shore. The prints looked fresh, as if they had been made very recently. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. Who could have been out here? There was no one else around for miles, and the footprints didn't look like they belonged to any animal I knew. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I felt a strange, uneasy feeling in my chest. I considered turning back, but my curiosity got the best of me, and I followed the footprints. They led around the lake and into the woods. As I walked deeper into the trees, I noticed the air growing colder, and the woods became eerily silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I kept going. After a few minutes, I came to a clearing in the woods. In the middle of the clearing was a small, old cabin. It looked abandoned, with its roof caving in and the windows covered in dust. But what struck me the most was that it was almost identical to the cabin I had rented, except for the fact that it looked much older and more run down. I stepped closer, confused and slightly afraid. Why was there another cabin out here? How could I have missed it on my way in? I was sure I had driven along the path that led to the cabin, and I hadn't seen anything like this. I felt a strange pull to the cabin, as if something was calling me to it. But I also felt a sense of dread. I wasn't supposed to be here. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, just staring at the cabin. I had a strong feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Instead, I took a few steps forward, toward the old building. The door creaked open, as if it had been waiting for me. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was dark, and the air smelled musty and stale. The walls were covered in mold, and the floor creaked under my weight. There was nothing inside but dust and old furniture. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange, a painting on the wall, just above the fireplace. It was a portrait of a woman, her face pale and lifeless. Her eyes seemed to follow me, no matter where I moved. I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed away from the painting, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. I needed to leave. I turned to head back to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. There was a loud bang from somewhere inside the cabin, like a door slamming shut. I whipped around, but there was no one there. I quickly ran out of the cabin and back into the woods. As I walked back to the lake, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one there. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I hurried back to the main cabin, locked the door behind me, and tried to calm down. I didn't want to think about the strange cabin or the painting, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. That night, the knocking came again. This time, it wasn't just a faint knock. It was loud and persistent, coming from the front door. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. I had no idea who could be knocking at this hour. I was alone, in the middle of the woods. I cautiously approached the door and looked out the window, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the darkness stretched out beyond the cabin. I opened the door, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But then, as I stepped outside, I saw something in the distance, just beyond the trees. A light. It flickered like a lantern, moving through the woods. I couldn't see who or what it was, but I knew it was out there waiting. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my mind racing. What was going on? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and ran to the car. I drove away in a hurry, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But no one was there. As I left the woods behind, I felt a strange sense of relief. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods was still watching me, waiting for me to come back. I never went back to that cabin. And to this day, I don't know what I saw in the woods or what that other cabin was. But I do know one thing. Some things are better left unexplored. I had been planning this weekend getaway for months. A small cabin deep in the woods, away from the noise and chaos of the city. I needed some time to clear my head and reconnect with myself. The moment I stepped out of my car and looked around, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves gently swaying in the wind. The air was fresh and cool, almost as if I could breathe more easily here than I could in the city. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined, simple, rustic, and isolated. It was a small wooden structure with a steep roof, tucked away among the trees. There was a large stone fireplace in the living room, and a couple of cozy chairs placed around it. A kitchen sat to one side, complete with everything I might need to prepare meals. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms, and the view from the windows was breathtaking. I could see the vast forest stretching endlessly in every direction. I quickly unpacked my things and decided to take a walk around the area. The sun was beginning to set, and the woods looked even more magical with the golden light streaming through the trees. I took a deep breath, feeling a deep sense of peace. But little did I know that peace was only temporary. As night fell, the quiet of the forest grew deeper. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of an owl. I made myself some dinner and sat down by the fireplace. The flames crackled and popped, casting warm light across the room. I had planned to read a book, but after a long day of driving and settling in, I felt too tired. I decided to go to bed early. The bedroom was just as cozy as the rest of the cabin, with a large, comfortable bed covered in thick blankets. I turned off the lights and lay down, staring at the wooden ceiling. The darkness outside seemed to stretch on forever, and the quiet was almost suffocating. But as I closed my eyes, I started to hear something. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. A soft sound like a whisper coming from somewhere behind the walls. I lay there, frozen, listening carefully. The whispering continued, but now it was a little louder. It almost sounded like a conversation, but I couldn't make out any words. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if someone was speaking in the next room. I told myself it was just the wind or perhaps the old cabin settling, but something about it didn't feel right. The whispering grew clearer, and this time I could make out my name. Emily. Emily. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, wide-eyed. There was no one else in the cabin. I was completely alone. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but I couldn't find one. I slowly got out of bed and stood still listening. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It felt like the air was thick with tension. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I had been under a lot of stress lately, and I hadn't slept much in the past few days. I lay back down, pulled the covers over my head, and forced myself to sleep. But the whispers didn't stop. Every few minutes, I would hear them again, closer and closer, until it sounded like someone was standing right next to my bed, speaking softly into my ear. I could feel the cold breath against my skin, but when I opened my eyes, there was no one there. The room was empty. The only sound was my own breath, rapid and panicked. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened it quickly and stepped outside into the cool night air, hoping that the fresh air would clear my head. But as I stood there, shivering, I realized that something was wrong. The woods were eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, just silence. I turned back to the cabin. The dim light from the windows made it look almost sinister, like something was watching me from within. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be causing the whispers. Maybe the cabin was old. Maybe the wood was just creaking and groaning in the night. But the way the whispers had called my name, so personal and familiar, felt like something far more sinister. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to go back inside and check the rest of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly made my way through the dark rooms. The living room was empty, and the kitchen was quiet. I checked the bathroom, the closets, even under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. I looked up at the walls, wondering if something, anything, could be causing the strange sounds. It would seem to hum with an odd energy, but that was it. Nothing else. Then, just as I was about to head back upstairs, I heard it again. Emily. This time, the voice was clearer than ever. It came from the wall behind me. I froze. My heart raced, and every instinct told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper sounded so close, so real. It felt like someone was right behind me, their breath hot on the back of my neck. I slowly turned around, and my flashlight flickered before it went out completely. I grabbed my phone, using its dim light to guide me upstairs. The shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch and shift, like they were alive. I reached the top of the stairs and walked toward the bedroom, but as I got closer, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer soft and distant. They were coming from every corner, every crack in the walls. I backed away, panic setting in. I felt like I was trapped, surrounded by voices that I couldn't escape. The cabin, which had once felt like a peaceful retreat, now felt like a prison. A prison with walls that knew my name. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was nothing there. I was alone, I told myself, just me in the dark, and yet the fear gnawed at my insides, telling me that something else was in the cabin with me. I ran downstairs again, nearly tripping over my own feet, and threw open the front door. I bolted outside into the night, gasping for breath. The cold air hit me like a shock, but the whispers still echoed in my ears, following me into the darkness. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I had to leave, but when I tried to go back to my car, it was as if the woods themselves had closed in on me. The path that had been clear earlier now seemed to twist and shift, and no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find my way back to the road. I stumbled through the trees, the whispers still growing louder with each step, until finally, I collapsed, exhausted and terrified. I could hear my name being called from all directions, coming from the very earth beneath me. I don't remember how long I lay there. When I woke up, it was still dark, but the whispers had stopped. I slowly got to my feet and started walking again, unsure of where I was going, but certain that I had to get away from that cursed cabin. Eventually, I found my way back to the road, and I didn't look back. I don't know what happened that night, but I can still hear the whispers sometimes, faintly, in the back of my mind. And whenever I pass by a cabin in the woods, I can't help but feel that strange, cold feeling wash over me again. The whispers never really stopped. They just moved on, waiting for the next person who is foolish enough to listen. It had been a long week at work, and I was desperate for a break. The constant emails, meetings, and deadlines were taking their toll. I needed to get away from it all. So, I rented a small cabin in the mountains, far from the noise of the city. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, with no neighbors for miles. I imagined spending my time hiking, reading, and simply relaxing in peace. It seemed like the perfect escape. When I arrived at the cabin, I was struck by how quiet it was. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves in the trees and the distant chirping of birds. The cabin itself was small but charming, made of dark wood with large windows that allowed the light to flood in. The front porch had a couple of rocking chairs, and the back door opened up to a view of the mountains. It looked like the kind of place where time slowed down, where I could forget about everything. After unpacking my things, I decided to take a walk around the area. The woods surrounding the cabin were dense and green, the trees so tall they seemed to touch the sky. I followed a narrow path that wound through the forest, my boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. The air smelled fresh, and the cool breeze felt refreshing against my skin. I walked for about an hour, enjoying the serenity, before heading back to the cabin. As the sun began to set, I made myself some dinner and sat by the fireplace. The crackling fire was comforting, and I let the warmth fill the room. I had brought a book with me, but I couldn't focus on reading. My mind kept wandering, and I found myself looking out the window, staring at the fading light as the sky turned a deep shade of purple. The shadows of the trees outside grew longer, stretching across the ground. After a while, I decided to go to bed. The cabin was small, and the bedroom was just a few steps away from the living room. The bed was comfortable, and I quickly settled under the blankets. But as I lay there, trying to fall asleep, something caught my attention. The room felt different. It wasn't anything I could explain at first, just a feeling of unease, like something wasn't quite right. I glanced around the room. The moonlight from the window cast soft shadows across the walls. The only furniture in the room was the bed, a small nightstand, and a full-length mirror on the opposite wall. The mirror was old, its frame dark and worn, but it didn't look out of place in the rustic room. I had noticed it earlier, but hadn't paid much attention to it. Now, though, I couldn't take my eyes off it. The reflection in the mirror seemed strange. For some reason, the image of the room in the mirror didn't match what I saw with my own eyes. The bed appeared slightly off-center, and the shadows on the walls seemed darker. But what made me uneasy wasn't just the way the room looked in the reflection. It was the fact that there was something else in the mirror. Something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But as I stared at the mirror, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was faint at first, like a shadow, but it slowly took shape. It was a person, a woman, dressed in a white gown. Her face was obscured by her long, dark hair, but I could see her standing there, perfectly still, staring at me. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there, standing in the same spot, watching me. It was as if she was waiting for something, but I had no idea what. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the shadows were playing with my mind. I turned away from the mirror and tried to calm myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the image of the woman in the mirror. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get her out of my mind. The next few hours passed in a blur. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like the woman in the mirror was still there, watching me. I tried to keep my mind occupied by thinking about the hike I had taken earlier, or about how nice it would be to sleep in tomorrow. But every time I looked over at the mirror, I saw her again. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and walked over to the mirror. My breath caught in my throat as I peered into it. The room looked normal again, just as it had when I first entered. There was no woman standing in the reflection. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The figure from earlier wasn't completely gone. It had moved. The woman's reflection was now standing beside the bed, her face still hidden by her long hair. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew she was there, and I could feel her presence like a weight in the room. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly turned away from the mirror. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get out of this room. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was after midnight. I was exhausted, but the idea of being in that room, with the reflection of the woman standing beside my bed, was too much. I decided to leave the cabin for a while, take a walk outside, and clear my head. The cool night air might help me shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I pulled on a jacket and stepped outside. The moon was high in the sky, and the forest around the cabin was eerily quiet. The only sound was the crunch of the leaves under my boots. I wandered through the woods for a while, trying to focus on the sounds of nature, hoping to calm my racing mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face, hidden beneath her hair, staring at me. I stayed outside for an hour or so, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, that I had been imagining things. But when I finally returned to the cabin, I felt the same unease settling back in. The cabin was dark and still, and the moment I stepped inside, I could feel that the atmosphere had changed. It was colder somehow, more oppressive. I walked into the bedroom, and there it was again, the mirror. The reflection was different now. The woman wasn't standing beside the bed anymore. She was standing directly in front of the mirror, facing me. Her head was slightly tilted, as if she were studying me. Her hair was long and black, covering her face, but there was something about her posture, something about the way she stood, that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore the mirror, but it was impossible. It felt like the woman was alive, like she was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't help myself. I took a few steps closer to the mirror, drawn by some strange force. As I got closer, I could see her face more clearly. It was pale, too pale, and her eyes were completely white. No pupils, no color, just empty, staring eyes. I gasped and stepped back, but as I did, the reflection in the mirror didn't move. It stayed exactly the same, as if it was frozen in place. But I knew better. I knew that the woman in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. She was something else, something that shouldn't be there. And she was waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and ran out of the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I had seen in the mirror, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I drove away that night, not caring where I went, just as long as it was far from that cabin, far from the woman in the mirror. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a ghost? A trick of the light? I don't know. All I know is that I'll never look at a mirror the same way again. Every time I pass one, I can't help but feel like something is watching me from within. And I'll never, ever go back to that cabin. It had been a long time since my friends and I had gone on a trip together. Between work, family, and life in general, we had all gotten busy. But this weekend was different. We decided to rent a cabin in the woods for a few days, just the four of us, me, Josh, Sam, and Leah. We were all excited to catch up and spend some time away from the city. We arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon, and it was everything we had hoped for. It was a small, wooden cabin nestled deep in the forest, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The air was fresh and clean, and the only sounds we could hear were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. The cabin itself was cozy and rustic, with a stone fireplace in the living room and large windows that looked out into the woods. We spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in, exploring the area, and getting to know the cabin. It felt like the perfect weekend. We cooked dinner together, shared stories, and laughed like we hadn't in years. As night fell, we lit a fire in the fireplace and sat around it, talking about everything from our childhood memories to our future dreams. It was nice to just relax and forget about the stress of everyday life. But as the night grew darker, something started to feel a little off. It wasn't anything specific, just a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The air seemed heavier, and the shadows outside the cabin appeared longer, like they were stretching toward us. But I didn't mention it to anyone. I figured it was just my imagination, playing tricks on me in the quiet of the woods. After a while, we all decided to turn in for the night. Leah and Sam went to one bedroom, while Josh and I took the other. I lay down in bed, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, trying to relax. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about how peaceful everything was, how perfect the weekend had started out. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of the door creaking open. I glanced over at Josh, but he was still fast asleep in the bed next to me. I sat up slowly, listening carefully. The door creaked again, followed by the sound of footsteps. My heart started to race. Who could be out there? We were so far from the nearest town, there was no way anyone could have made it to the cabin without us hearing them. I got out of bed and tiptoed to the door, my mind racing. I peeked out into the hallway, but the house was silent. There was no one there. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling or the wind playing tricks, but the unease lingered. I decided to check on the others. I knocked on Leah and Sam's door, but got no response. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. My nerves were starting to get the best of me, and I decided to go in. The room was empty. The bed was undisturbed, and everything seemed perfectly normal. I frowned, feeling confused and a little scared. I quickly went back to our room and found Josh still asleep. But something didn't feel right. The night seemed colder, the air heavier. I lay back down, hoping to shake the feeling, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps I had heard. Who or what was out there? I managed to fall asleep eventually, but it wasn't a restful sleep. The next morning, I woke up to an empty cabin. Josh was already up and making breakfast in the kitchen, but Leah and Sam were nowhere to be found. I assumed they had gone out for an early morning walk or hike, so I didn't think much of it at first. But as the hours passed and they didn't return, I began to grow concerned. "Josh, have you seen Leah and Sam?" I asked as I sat down to eat. He looked up from the stove, his brow furrowed. "No, I thought they were with you last night." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I haven't seen them since last night. I thought they were in their room. Josh looked at me, his expression turning serious. "That's weird. I haven't seen them either." We decided to search the cabin, calling out their names as we went from room to room. The place was quiet, too quiet. It was like the cabin itself was holding its breath. We checked the bathroom, the closets, even under the beds, but there was no sign of Leah or Sam. I tried to convince myself that they had simply gone for a walk or found somewhere to explore. But something in the back of my mind told me that wasn't the case. We went outside next, hoping to find them nearby. The woods around the cabin were thick and dense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The path that led away from the cabin had been disturbed, as if someone had walked through it recently. There were footprints in the soft ground, but they didn't seem to belong to Leah or Sam. They were too large, too heavy, and they seemed to be leading away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. My heart started to race again. "Josh, do you see this?" I asked, pointing at the footprints. "These aren't theirs." Josh looked down at the ground and then back at me, his face pale. "No, they're not." We followed the footprints for what felt like hours, calling out for Leah and Sam as we walked deeper into the forest. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The woods were silent, too silent. There were no birds singing, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, oppressive silence. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We reached a clearing, and that's when we saw it. The footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing, and there, in the center of the space, was a backpack. It was Sam's backpack, the one he always carried with him on trips. My stomach twisted in knots as I reached down to pick it up. There was no sign of Sam or Leah. Just the backpack, lying there as if someone had dropped it without a second thought. "We need to go back to the cabin," Josh said, his voice shaking. I nodded, too afraid to argue. We turned and headed back, but the unease didn't leave me. It was worse now. The silence in the woods was deafening, and every step we took seemed to echo in the stillness. When we got back to the cabin, I grabbed my phone and tried to call Leah and Sam, but there was no answer. I called their phones again and again, but it was as if they had vanished into thin air. Night fell, and the woods outside the cabin seemed even darker, more oppressive. We were both on edge, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard footsteps, but when I opened my eyes, there was no one there. The door creaked open several times throughout the night, but when I checked, the cabin was empty. I kept thinking I could hear faint whispers, like someone was calling my name, but whenever I turned around, there was no one there. The next day, we called the authorities, but when they arrived, there was no trace of Leah or Sam. Their belongings were still inside the cabin, and the search through the woods turned up nothing. The only thing that remained were those strange footprints, leading into the trees and disappearing without a trace. Josh and I stayed at the cabin for a few more days, waiting for news, but none came. The police told us they couldn't find anything, and eventually, they gave up the search. They told us it was as if Leah and Sam had simply vanished. It didn't make sense. It still doesn't. To this day, I don't know what happened to them. Were they taken by something in the woods? Did they wander off and get lost? Or was there something else, something darker, in that forest waiting for us? I don't know, but I can never go back there. I can never shake the feeling that something is still out there, watching, waiting for the next person who dares to set foot in those woods. And I'll never forget the footsteps I heard that night, echoing in the silence, following me even after I left. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. My friends and I had been planning it for months, a break from the chaos of our daily lives. We had rented a cabin in the woods, hoping to relax, have fun, and enjoy nature. There were 5 of us in total, me, Amy, Rachel, John, and Mark. We all worked together at the same company, and though we were close friends, our busy schedules had kept us from hanging out in a while. This trip was the perfect chance to reconnect. The cabin, called Cabin 14, was nestled deep in the forest. We rented it for the weekend through a website that specializes in remote getaways. The reviews were excellent, and the pictures online made it look like a peaceful, cozy place to escape from the stress of our busy lives. We were excited, and after weeks of planning, we were finally heading out. We arrived at the cabin late on a Friday afternoon. It was a large, old log cabin surrounded by towering trees, and there was a small creek running through the property. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and there was a certain calmness in the atmosphere that immediately put me at ease. The cabin was a bit more rustic than I expected, but that only added to the charm. It had a large front porch with rocking chairs, a big living room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with everything we needed to cook our meals. It was the perfect retreat. After unpacking, we spent the evening cooking and eating dinner together. The mood was light, and we laughed and caught up on each other's lives. There was no cell service in the area, which was a welcome change. We were disconnected from the outside world, and it felt like we were in our own little bubble, far from everything. As night fell, we lit a fire in the living room and played board games, just enjoying each other's company. But as the hours passed and the fire crackled down to embers, I began to notice something strange. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to change. At first, I thought it was just the darkness outside, but the air inside the cabin felt heavier, colder. It wasn't freezing, but there was a noticeable chill in the air that seemed to settle in the corners of the room. Does anyone else feel that? I asked, shivering slightly. Mark, who was sitting across from me, raised an eyebrow. Feel what? It's just the fire. Maybe we should throw some more wood on it. But I wasn't so sure. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something else, something that I couldn't explain. I brushed it off, though, telling myself that I was just tired. Everyone else seemed fine, so I didn't want to bring it up again. After a while, we all decided to call it a night. The guys went to one bedroom, and Rachel and I shared the other. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cabin was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors and the wind rustling outside. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable, but my mind kept racing. I thought I heard faint footsteps in the hallway outside the room, but when I checked, there was no one there. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the house settling, but I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that lingered in the air. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke up to the sound of the door opening. At first, I thought it was Rachel getting up, but when I turned to look, I saw that she was still fast asleep next to me. The door creaked as if someone had opened it slowly, but when I looked toward the hallway, I saw nothing. The house was still. My heart raced. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was impossible. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. After a while, I gave up on sleep and decided to get up. I quietly slipped out of bed and walked down the hallway to check on the others. When I reached the living room, I found Mark sitting on the couch, staring at the fire. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Mark, what's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. He turned to me slowly, his gaze distant. "I don't know. I woke up and heard someone walking around. I thought it was one of you, but when I looked, there was no one there." I froze, a chill running down my spine. "You heard footsteps too?" Mark nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, it's like someone is here, but they're not." I didn't know what to say. I felt the same way, but I didn't want to believe it. We both sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Then we heard it again, the sound of footsteps, faint but distinct, coming from the hallway. We both turned toward the door, but it was dark. The hallway seemed empty, but I felt a sudden wave of fear wash over me. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, unable to speak. My heart was pounding in my chest. We both stood up, walking toward the hallway, our footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. I reached for the light switch, but before I could turn it on, I felt a cold breeze rush past me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Mark and I both froze, staring into the darkness. We didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but there was something else, an eerie, hollow sound coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. It was like a low, almost inaudible hum, and it seemed to vibrate in the air. I felt nauseous, like something was wrong with the very foundation of the cabin. "I'm going to check the others," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't stay in the hallway any longer. Something wasn't right, and I needed to find Rachel and Amy. I rushed to the bedroom, my feet pounding against the wooden floor. I opened the door and found Rachel and Amy still asleep. Their breathing was steady, and they looked peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I checked under the bed and in the closet, but there was no sign of anyone else. I turned back to Mark. "We need to leave. Something's wrong with this place." Mark didn't say anything. He just nodded, his face pale and filled with fear. We didn't know what was happening, but we both knew that we weren't safe in the cabin anymore. We woke up the others, and as we packed our things, we noticed something that sent a wave of dread through me. The door to the outside was wide open. We were sure we had locked it when we came in, but now it was open, the cold night air blowing in. "We need to get out of here now," Amy said, her voice trembling as she looked at the door. We didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed our bags and rushed out of the cabin, not caring about the car or our belongings. We just wanted to leave. As we drove away, the cabin in the rearview mirror grew smaller and smaller until it was just a distant silhouette in the forest. We didn't speak much on the way back. We were all shaken by what had happened, but none of us could explain it. The footsteps, the cold air, the strange hum in the cabin, it didn't make sense. When we got back to town, we tried to talk about it, but the more we discussed it, the more confused we became. We couldn't explain the events of that night. No one had been in the cabin with us, and there was no logical reason for the things we heard and felt. The authorities didn't take us seriously when we told them about the strange occurrences. They just chalked it up to imagination and fear. But deep down, we all knew something was wrong with that cabin. There was something dark in the woods, something that didn't want us there. And even though we left, I knew that the memory of Cabin 14 would stay with us forever. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we were never alone in that cabin. Sometimes, I'll hear footsteps in the hallway when I'm alone, or feel a cold breeze rush past me. I don't know if it was the cabin or something else, but I'll never forget that night. The terror, the feeling of being watched, it was real. And I'll never, ever go back to Cabin 14. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just me and my friends. The plan was simple: rent a cabin by the lake, enjoy the fresh air, and leave all the stress of everyday life behind. We all needed a break, and this cabin was the perfect place for it. There were 5 of us: me, Jack, Emma, Sarah, and Ben. We had been friends for years, and this was our first trip together in a long time. The idea of spending a few days surrounded by nature, away from the noise of the city, sounded like the perfect way to recharge. The cabin we rented was a small, wooden house by a serene lake, tucked away in the mountains. It was about 2 hours away from the nearest town, far enough to feel completely isolated. The pictures online made it look perfect, rustic, cozy, and peaceful. We couldn't wait to get there. When we arrived, the place looked just like in the pictures, maybe even better. The lake was calm and clear, reflecting the blue sky above. The cabin was surrounded by tall trees, creating a natural barrier that made it feel even more private. There was a small dock that led out to the lake, where we could go fishing or just sit and relax by the water. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was everything we had hoped for. We unpacked the car and settled in, eager to start our weekend of fun and relaxation. We spent the first few hours exploring the area around the cabin. The lake was just a short walk away, and we spent some time sitting by the water, chatting and taking in the view. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze that made the air feel crisp and clean. Everything was peaceful, just as we had imagined. After a while, we decided to head back to the cabin and start preparing dinner. We cooked together, laughing and talking as we chopped vegetables and grilled fish by the fireplace. It felt good to be away from the usual rush of life. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly relaxed. As the sun set, we sat around the fire, eating our dinner and talking. The conversation flowed easily, and we all felt like we were reconnecting in a way we hadn't in a long time. But as the night wore on, I began to notice something strange. The air, which had been warm and comfortable earlier, was starting to feel colder. Not cold enough to make us uncomfortable, but enough for me to notice. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just the evening chill settling in. But as the darkness grew deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jack noticed it too. He shivered and pulled his jacket tighter around him. "Weird," he said. "It wasn't this cold earlier." I agreed, but didn't say anything more about it. It was probably just the temperature changing as night fell. But the more I sat there, the more uneasy I began to feel. The lake, which had looked peaceful earlier, now seemed darker and more ominous. The trees, once gentle and welcoming, now looked like looming shadows. The wind had picked up a bit, and the rustling of the leaves sounded different, almost unnatural. "I think we should go inside," Sarah said suddenly. She was sitting next to me, and I could tell by the look on her face that she was feeling it too. Her eyes were darting nervously toward the lake, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if she was expecting someone or something to appear. "Yeah, I'm getting a weird vibe out here," Emma agreed. "Let's head in." We all stood up and made our way back to the cabin. But even as we stepped inside, the strange feeling didn't go away. The warmth of the cabin was comforting, but there was still something in the air that made me feel uneasy. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, but it was hard to ignore. The cabin was silent, too silent, and the only sounds were the faint creaks of the wooden floors and the occasional snap from the fireplace. We settled down in the living room, trying to relax, but the strange feeling persisted. After a while, we started talking about ghost stories. We didn't believe in that sort of thing, but the atmosphere in the cabin was making us all a little jumpy. We laughed about it, trying to brush off the tension, but the more we joked, the more it felt like something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but there was an energy in the air that made me feel like we weren't alone. As the night wore on, we decided to go to bed. The strange feeling didn't leave me, though. I kept hearing little noises in the cabin, creaks, whispers, and soft thuds that seemed to come from somewhere in the dark corners of the house. I kept telling myself it was just the house settling, but it was hard to ignore. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. It felt like the cabin was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang. It came from the kitchen, followed by the sound of something scraping across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The others must have heard it too, because I could hear them stirring in their rooms. What was that? Jack's voice called from down the hallway. I don't know, I replied, my voice shaking. It came from the kitchen. We all got out of bed and gathered in the hallway, our faces pale with fear. I didn't know what was going on, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. We crept down the hallway toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under our feet. As we approached, I felt a sudden chill, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The kitchen light was on, and everything seemed normal at first. But then I saw it. A chair was overturned on the floor, and a pot had been knocked off the stove. The kitchen was a mess, but it didn't make sense. We had all been in the living room just a few minutes before. No one had been in the kitchen. I turned to look at my friends. Did anyone else go in there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No, Ben said, shaking his head. We were all in the living room. We all stood there, unsure of what to do next. The silence in the cabin felt suffocating, and I could feel my pulse racing. What was going on? I could feel something watching us, something just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We decided to leave the kitchen and go back to the living room, but just as we were about to turn around, I heard something behind me. A low, guttural whisper, like someone was speaking right in my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. Did you hear that? I gasped, my voice trembling. Everyone froze, staring at me. Hear what? Emma asked, her voice shaky. I swear I heard someone whispering, I said, my heart pounding in my chest. The others didn't seem to hear it, but I knew what I had heard. It was clear, like someone was right behind me, speaking softly but urgently. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice frantic. This place is messed up. Something's not right. We all agreed, though none of us knew exactly what was happening. We grabbed our things and rushed to the front door, but just as we reached for the handle, the lights flickered. Then they went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. I heard a noise behind me, a loud crash, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. My blood ran cold. Go, Jack shouted, shoving me toward the door. We burst outside, running into the night, our hearts racing with fear. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but it didn't stop us. We didn't look back. We ran toward the car, barely able to see in the darkness. The only sounds were our panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. When we reached the car, we didn't stop to look around. We jumped in, started the engine, and sped away as fast as we could. We didn't talk much on the drive back, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We never returned to that cabin, and we never spoke about it again. The events of that night were too strange, too terrifying to fully comprehend. But one thing was clear. Whatever haunted that cabin by the lake, it didn't want us there. I still think about it sometimes. The whispering, the footsteps, the strange feeling in the air. I don't know what it was, but I know I'll never forget that night. And I'll never go back to that cabin. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the hustle and bustle of daily life. My friends and I had been talking about it for months, and finally, we were on our way. The plan was to rent a cabin in the woods, far away from everything, and just spend time together, enjoying nature and disconnecting from the stress of work and school. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Emma, and my cousin Sophie. We had all been close for years, and this trip was something we had been looking forward to for a long time. The cabin we rented was located deep in the woods, far away from the nearest town. It was a cozy little place, made of wood and stone, with a small porch that overlooked a quiet stream. The pictures online made it look perfect, a peaceful escape where we could relax, explore, and enjoy the beautiful surroundings. We arrived in the late afternoon, and the cabin was even more charming than it had looked in the photos. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine trees filled the atmosphere. It was just what we needed. After we unpacked, we decided to take a short walk around the property. The woods were beautiful, with tall trees and a trail that wound through them, leading down to the stream. We walked for a while, talking and laughing as we went. It felt nice to be away from everything, away from the noise and pressure of the city. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. Everything felt calm and peaceful. As the sun began to set, we made our way back to the cabin. The temperature had dropped slightly, and a light breeze was blowing through the trees. We lit a fire in the cabin's fireplace and sat around it, enjoying the warmth as the night grew darker. The only light in the cabin was from the fire and a couple of lamps, creating a cozy, intimate atmosphere. We talked and joked, playing cards and telling stories as the night went on. It was the perfect evening, and we were all in high spirits. But as the hours passed, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything big, just a general sense of unease that seemed to settle over the cabin. At first, I thought it was just me, but when I looked around, I noticed that everyone seemed to feel it too. Jake was quieter than usual, and Emma kept looking over her shoulder, as if she thought someone was behind her. Sophie, who usually loved to talk, was staring into the fire, her face unusually serious. I didn't want to say anything at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. "Do you guys feel that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked at me, his brow furrowed. "Feel what?" "The air," I said, glancing around. "It's like something's not right." Emma nodded, her face pale. "I know what you mean. It feels colder in here, like something's watching us." Sophie looked up at that, her eyes wide. "I thought it was just me," she said quietly. We all fell silent, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something else, something in the air that made the room feel heavy. The fire crackled loudly, but the noise seemed too sharp in the stillness. I tried to push the feeling aside, but it kept nagging at me, like a whisper in the back of my mind. We decided to go to bed, hoping that some rest would help us feel better. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, one with a large bed and one with 2 smaller ones. Jake and Emma took the larger bedroom, while Sophie and I shared one of the smaller rooms. As we lay down in the dark, the unease didn't leave. It felt like the cabin was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to fall asleep, but every little noise made me jump. The wind outside was picking up, and the trees were creaking in the night, making strange, groaning sounds. It almost sounded like someone was walking around outside, but I told myself it was just the wind. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, but it was hard to relax. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard something. A loud knock on the door. It wasn't the kind of knock you would expect from someone trying to get your attention. This was more like a bang, a sharp, heavy sound that made the whole cabin shake. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Sophie, who was lying next to me. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" We both got out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway toward the living room. We were careful not to wake Jake and Emma, who were still asleep in the other room. The front door was locked, and there was no way anyone could have knocked without us hearing them approach. But when we got to the living room, the door was wide open. I froze, staring at it. The door was completely open, and the cold night air was pouring in. I couldn't believe it. We had locked it before going to bed. There was no way it could have opened on its own. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't. It didn't make any sense. "Is anyone else awake?" I whispered. Sophie shook her head. "No, I don't think so." We both stood there for a moment, staring at the open door, and then we heard it again, a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped. This time, it came from the back of the cabin, from the direction of the bedrooms. "Let's go wake them up," I said, my voice trembling. We rushed down the hallway to Jake and Emma's room and knocked on the door. When there was no answer, I opened it slowly. Jake and Emma were both still in bed, but their faces were pale, and they were both staring at the ceiling wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Jake nodded, his voice hoarse. I thought I was imagining it. I didn't want to say anything. Sophie and I stepped into the room, and we all just stood there for a moment, listening. The house was completely silent now, but the uneasy feeling was still there. I don't know how long we stood like that, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, we decided to leave. We couldn't stay there any longer, not with the door open and those strange noises. We quickly packed up our things and rushed out of the cabin. We didn't even stop to look around. We just got in the car and drove as fast as we could, not looking back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, dark and silent, standing alone in the woods. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. I will never go back to that cabin. It was a last-minute decision to go on a weekend trip, but I was glad I agreed. My cousin Mia had called me up one Friday afternoon, suggesting a cabin getaway in the mountains. Mia was one of those people who loved adventure, and she convinced me it would be fun. I needed a break from the usual routine anyway, so I packed my bags and we set off the next morning. Mia had found the cabin through an online listing. It was tucked away in the mountains, a few hours away from the nearest town. The pictures made it look like the perfect spot for a quiet escape. An old wooden cabin surrounded by towering trees, with a clear stream running nearby. It seemed like a dream. The cabin was the kind of place you imagine when you think of a peaceful retreat in the wilderness. We arrived just before sunset, and I immediately felt a sense of calm wash over me as we got out of the car. The air was crisp, the scent of pine trees fresh and clean. The area was so quiet that the only sounds I could hear were the birds and the rustling leaves. I felt like I had entered a completely different world, far away from the noise of everyday life. The cabin itself was small but charming. It had a stone fireplace and large windows that looked out into the forest. The place was surrounded by tall trees, and there was a small trail leading down to a bubbling creek behind the cabin. Everything was perfect, just like the pictures. I could already tell this was going to be a great weekend. After unpacking our things, we decided to take a walk around the area. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting a soft golden glow over the forest. Mia and I walked down the trail that led toward the creek. The ground was soft beneath our feet, and the air felt cool, but not uncomfortable. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost. As we walked, we talked about life, catching up on everything that had been going on since we last saw each other. But there was something strange about the forest. It wasn't just the silence, it was deeper than that. The trees were so dense that the sunlight barely made it through the branches. It felt like we were in a different world, cut off from everything else. I could feel my heart begin to race a little, but I told myself it was just the excitement of being somewhere so unfamiliar. When we reached the creek, we stopped and sat on a large rock by the water. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks was soothing. We stayed there for a while, just enjoying the serenity of the place. Mia seemed completely at ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling lingered. There was an odd heaviness in the air, like the world around me was holding its breath. The sun was nearly gone when we decided to head back to the cabin. As we walked back up the trail, I noticed something strange. There were no animal sounds. No birds, no rustling in the trees, no insects buzzing around. Everything was unnervingly still. It wasn't normal for a forest to be this quiet, especially at dusk. I glanced at Mia, but she didn't seem to notice anything. She was too busy chatting about something I wasn't paying attention to. We arrived back at the cabin just as darkness fell, and I was grateful to be inside. The atmosphere outside had started to feel oppressive. The quietness of the forest made everything feel eerily empty, like we were the only ones there. We lit a fire in the cabin's fireplace and made ourselves comfortable. The warm glow from the fire was comforting, but something in the air still felt wrong. Mia suggested we have a late dinner and just relax for the evening. I agreed, and we sat around the table eating takeout. The fire crackled in the background, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I thought I heard a faint sound, like a whisper just at the edge of my hearing. But whenever I looked around, there was nothing there. After dinner, we decided to play a board game to pass the time. We laughed and joked, but I couldn't completely relax. Every so often, I would glance toward the window, as if expecting to see something moving outside. But the forest was still, and the night was silent. The only light came from the fire, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Around midnight, Mia went to bed. I wasn't tired yet, so I stayed up, reading a book by the fire. The room felt warmer now, and I was starting to feel drowsy. I figured I'd go to bed soon too. But just as I was about to put my book down, I heard something outside, a soft rustling in the trees, followed by a low thud. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I waited, listening intently. There it was again, Another rustling sound, then a creak, as if something heavy was moving through the forest. I slowly stood up and walked over to the window, peering outside. The trees were still, and nothing appeared out of place. I felt silly for getting so worked up. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer or a raccoon, maybe. But then I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, near the edge of the forest, there was a shadow. It was too dark to make out any details, but the shape of it was wrong. It was tall, too tall for a person, and it moved in a way that was unsettling, like it was gliding rather than walking. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know if I had imagined it or if something was really out there, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. I quickly closed the curtains and backed away from the window. My mind raced, and I tried to calm myself. It was just my imagination, I thought. Maybe I had been reading for too long. I went to bed and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I was exhausted. I barely slept, tossing and turning all night. I didn't want to mention the strange shadow I had seen, not wanting to sound paranoid. Mia was already up and making coffee, her usual cheerful self. "You okay?" she asked, noticing how tired I looked. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well," I replied, trying to smile. "I think I just need some coffee." We spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin. I didn't mention the shadow from the night before, but I kept my eyes peeled as we walked through the woods. The forest still had that same strange silence, but I tried to ignore it. The day was beautiful, and we even went down to the creek again, where we skipped rocks and laughed. But the uneasy feeling in the back of my mind didn't go away. As the day went on, I began to notice more odd things. The forest seemed even quieter than before. There were no animals, no birds chirping, not even the wind rustling through the trees. It was like the entire world had gone still. And then, as we walked back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I saw it again. The shadow, just at the edge of the trees, watching us. This time, I was sure I wasn't imagining it. I froze, my heart racing. The shadow was back, and it was closer this time. I grabbed Mia's arm. "We need to go back to the cabin. Now." She looked at me, confused. "What's wrong?" "I saw something out there. I'm not sure what it was, but it wasn't normal." Mia didn't argue. We quickly made our way back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. As soon as we were inside, I locked the door and closed all the windows. I didn't know what was out there, but I wasn't going to find out. That night, we didn't leave the cabin. We stayed by the fire, talking in whispers, keeping the curtains drawn and the door locked. I don't know what it was that I saw in the forest, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to be there anymore. Something in that place wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We left the next morning, not looking back. Whatever had been lurking in the forest was still out there, and I had no intention of finding out what it was. I had always been a city person. The noise, the crowds, the constant rush of life. It was all part of the rhythm I had come to know. But every now and then, I felt the urge to escape. To get away from the constant buzz, the work emails, the endless notifications. A quiet break, a few days in nature, seemed like just what I needed to reset. So I rented a cabin. The process of finding the cabin was straightforward. I searched online, filtering for remote places that offered solitude. Most of the listings were standard, small, rustic cabins on the edge of a forest or by a lake. They promised tranquility and the charm of nature, with only the sound of birds and wind to keep you company. One listing caught my eye, a cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from any town or main road. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind. The photos showed a modest wooden cabin surrounded by towering trees, a creek flowing nearby, and an untouched landscape. The price was reasonable, and the owner, a woman named Joan, was friendly and responsive. The cabin was located a couple of hours outside the city. I rented a car, packed a few things, and set off early that Friday morning, looking forward to a weekend of complete isolation. The drive was scenic, with winding roads through hills and valleys. I passed through small towns and open fields before the landscape shifted, becoming denser with trees as I neared the forest where the cabin was situated. There were no signs for the cabin, just a vague description of its location. The owner had left specific directions, though, which led me down increasingly narrow roads and eventually to a gravel path. The further I drove, the more the outside world seemed to fade away. The silence outside the car was overwhelming, interrupted only by the crunch of the gravel beneath the tires. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It stood alone, far from anything else, hidden in the forest like a relic from another time. It was exactly as described, a weathered two-story wooden structure with a small porch. A set of stone steps led up to the door, and there were a few scattered trees around the cabin, their branches heavy with the weight of age. The entire place had a rustic, almost forgotten feel. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and walked to the door. A small note was taped to it, with the keys and instructions on how to lock up when I left. I entered the cabin. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The floors were old wood, creaking underfoot. The living room had a stone fireplace, and the furniture looked like it had been there for years. Heavy, solid pieces, but worn, with a history all their own. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove and a fridge that hummed faintly. A dining table sat near the window, which overlooked the dense forest. Upstairs was a small bedroom with a double bed covered in a simple quilt. Everything had an old, rustic charm to it, but there was something about the cabin that made it feel isolated. Almost too isolated. After settling in, I decided to explore the area. I grabbed my coat, a flashlight, and stepped outside. The air was chilly but refreshing, and the silence was deep, almost suffocating. There were no sounds of distant traffic, no planes overhead, no voices, just the soft rustle of the trees and the occasional bird. I walked down the small path that ran alongside the cabin, following it into the woods. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the trees stretched high above me, their bare branches creaking in the wind. The farther I went, the more the light from the cabin faded, swallowed by the thick trees. The forest seemed endless, stretching in every direction, each tree indistinguishable from the next. The quiet was unsettling. It was peaceful, sure, but there was something about the isolation that gnawed at me. The path twisted and turned, disappearing into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I would turn around, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, but no one was there. I stopped at a small clearing where a creek ran through, its water trickling over the rocks. I sat on a boulder by the water, trying to calm my mind. The forest was so still, so empty. There was something odd about it. I couldn't quite place it, but it felt like something was off. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the deep quiet of the woods. But no matter how I tried to relax, the feeling lingered. After a while, I stood up and started walking back toward the cabin. The trees around me seemed to close in as I moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But when I reached the cabin, the feeling faded, and I told myself it was nothing. I was just overthinking things. That night, I cooked dinner and settled in by the fire. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and I tried to forget the unease that had crept up on me earlier. I read a book, drank some wine, and listened to the crackling of the fire. But the noises outside, the wind in the trees, kept pulling my attention. The house seemed to groan with every gust of wind, as if it were alive. It was unsettling. As the night wore on, I started hearing something strange. At first, it was a faint sound, like something scraping against the walls. I froze, listening. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I stood up, walked over to the walls, and pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. It stopped. I stepped back, unsure if I had imagined it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I went back to the fire and tried to ignore it. Around midnight, the sound returned. This time, it was louder. It sounded like something was moving inside the walls. Something dragging, scraping, almost like nails. I grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously through the cabin, checking every room, the attic, and the cellar. But there was nothing. Just empty rooms and dark corners. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old wood, creaking floors. Nothing more. But as I lay in bed that night, the feeling didn't go away. The house was still. Too still. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The sun was shining, but the cabin felt dark and closed off. I tried to shake off the odd feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was in a remote cabin in the woods. It was bound to be quiet, even unnerving at times. But something still didn't sit right with me. I decided to explore the area more. I walked along the creek again, further than I had gone the day before. The air felt heavier now, and the woods seemed even more desolate. The trees looked darker, like they were closing in on me. I wandered for hours, but it wasn't until I turned to go back that I noticed something. At the edge of the clearing, hidden behind some bushes, was a small wooden shed. I hadn't seen it before. It was old and weathered, with moss growing over the door. Curious, I approached the shed. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The air was damp and musty. There was nothing inside at first glance, just some old tools and crates. But then, in the far corner, I noticed something odd. A small pile of dirt had been recently disturbed. The ground was uneven, as if something had been buried there. My heart skipped a beat. I backed out of the shed, the unease growing. The air felt colder, and the forest seemed quieter than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something about this place was hiding something, and I had just uncovered a part of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds returned, the scraping, the thuds, the creaks of the cabin. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A soft, muffled thump, followed by a scraping sound from below. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the cellar. I grabbed the flashlight and, without thinking, rushed downstairs. The door to the cellar was shut tight, but the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from underneath. I reached for the handle and pulled the door open. The stairs leading down into the darkness felt like they went on forever. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I descended slowly, the air growing colder as I reached the bottom. The cellar was damp, filled with old wooden shelves and crates. But there, in the corner, was something I hadn't seen before, a door. Small, barely noticeable, hidden behind the shelves. I approached it cautiously and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dirt-filled tunnel. It was too dark to see what was beyond, but the air was thick and musty. I stepped forward, my breath shallow, my flashlight trembling in my hands. I had to know what was down here. I walked through the tunnel, my pulse racing, until I reached a small room. There was a wooden chest in the center, and I could feel something cold in the air, something ancient. I opened the chest slowly. Inside, there were old, faded objects, rusted tools, broken glass, and a few human bones. My stomach lurched. I backed away, my heart racing. I knew enough to understand what I had found. The bones were old, but they were human. The chest had been hidden for a reason. Someone, or something, had been keeping secrets in this cabin. I turned and ran back up the stairs, slamming the cellar door behind me. I didn't stop until I was in the car, speeding away from the cabin as fast as I could. The woods seemed to watch me as I left, silent and still, but I knew something would always be there, hidden in the dark corners of that cabin. As I drove back to the city, I couldn't stop shaking. I knew the truth now, but I also knew I was lucky to leave. Some places hold secrets, dark, hidden truths that should never be uncovered. And I had found one. The first night in the cabin was peaceful. The air was cold but fresh, and the silence was almost soothing. I had come here to get away from the noise of the city, to clear my mind and find some peace. The cabin was small but cozy, a perfect hideaway in the middle of a dense forest. The trees around were tall and dark, swaying gently in the breeze. As the evening turned into night, I lit a small fire in the fireplace and settled on the couch with a book. I felt calm for the first time in weeks. Outside, the forest was quiet, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves. I let myself relax, sinking into the warmth of the fire. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. The bedroom was simple, a bed, a small wooden dresser, and a window that faced the forest. I left the window slightly open to let in the cool night air. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of sleep pulling me under. Then I heard it, a scream. It wasn't distant or faint. It was sharp, loud, and filled with pure terror. My heart leaped in my chest, and I sat up, wide awake. The sound had come from outside, somewhere in the woods. It was unmistakable, a human scream. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. My logical mind told me it could be an animal. Some animals can make sounds that resemble human cries. But deep down, I knew this wasn't an animal. It was too raw, too full of fear. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated at the door. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help? But what if it was something dangerous? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, I opened the door. The cold air hit me immediately, and the forest was darker than I had imagined. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it wasn't much help. The trees cast long, eerie shadows, and every rustle of leaves made my heart pound. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. Is someone out there? There was no response. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. Even the wind had stopped. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting. But there was nothing. Slowly, I backed into the cabin and locked the door. I told myself it was just my imagination or a trick of the wind. I didn't really believe it, but I wanted to. As I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scream had sounded so close, but now everything was quiet. Too quiet. I finally fell into an uneasy sleep, but it didn't last long. The scream came again. This time, it was louder, more desperate. My eyes flew open, and I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound echoed through the forest, chilling me to my core. I grabbed the flashlight again, but this time, I didn't open the door. Instead, I crept to the window and peered outside. The forest was still. There was no sign of movement, no sign of anyone. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The scream hadn't come from the forest. It had come from inside the cabin. My hands started to shake, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. How was that possible? I was alone. I had locked the door. "Hello." I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I slowly walked through the cabin, checking every corner, every shadow. The flashlight's beam flickered slightly, and I cursed under my breath. My footsteps sounded too loud in the quiet cabin, each creak of the floorboards making me jump. But there was nothing. The cabin was empty. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream. Maybe I hadn't fully woken up. Maybe the scream was in my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I returned to bed, leaving the flashlight on the nightstand and the bedroom light on. Sleep didn't come easily, but exhaustion eventually took over. I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was faint, a low murmuring that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the living room. My heart raced as I reached for the flashlight, the beam shaking as I walked toward the door. The murmuring stopped as soon as I stepped into the living room. The fireplace, which I had left dark, was now lit, a warm orange glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. The window by the couch, the one that faced the forest, showed my reflection. But it wasn't right. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't. I froze, unable to move. The reflection tilted its head, its grin widening. Slowly, it raised a hand and waved at me. My own hand stayed at my side, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then the reflection stepped forward. It wasn't in the window anymore. It was in the room, standing by the couch, smiling at me with eyes that were far too dark. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and I heard footsteps moving toward me. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the footsteps didn't stop. I grabbed the flashlight and fumbled to turn it back on. When the beam finally lit up the room, there was nothing there. The reflection was gone. The fire in the fireplace had gone out, leaving only cold ashes. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight and staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left the cabin without looking back. Even now, I can still hear the scream in my mind. It echoes, sharp and desperate, a sound I'll never forget. But the worst part? Sometimes, when I look into a mirror, I swear I see my reflection smiling back at me. The cabin was perfect, exactly what I needed for a quiet weekend away. Tucked deep in the woods, it was small, rustic, and isolated, with a view of the forest from every window. After weeks of stress, I wanted nothing more than peace, quiet, and a break from people. When I arrived, the cabin felt warm and inviting. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, and the forest seemed alive with the chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I unloaded my bags, placing them on the small kitchen table before taking a look around. The cabin was simple: one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with an old stone fireplace. The wood-paneled walls made the place feel cozy. I could tell it had been here for decades, maybe longer. But there was one thing that stood out: a door in the corner of the living room. It was small, made of thick, dark wood, and locked with an old, rusted padlock. At first, I didn't think much of it. Many old cabins had storage areas or cellars that people locked up. Still, there was something about the door that made me uneasy. The lock looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and the air near it felt colder than the rest of the room. I shook off the feeling, reminding myself that I was here to relax, not to let my imagination run wild. That first night was peaceful. I made myself a simple dinner, lit a fire in the fireplace, and curled up on the couch with a book. The crackling of the fire and the gentle hum of the forest outside were the only sounds, and I found myself beginning to unwind. When it was time for bed, I climbed into the soft, slightly creaky bed and let sleep take over. But around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you. Then I heard it, a faint knocking sound. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The knocking was soft, almost hesitant, but it was steady. My first thought was that it was some kind of animal. Maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had gotten into the walls. Grabbing my flashlight, I crept out of bed and into the living room. The knocking was louder now, and I realized it was coming from the locked door in the corner. Standing in front of the door, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The knocking stopped. I stared at the door, waiting, but nothing happened. Finally, I convinced myself it must have been the wind or the house settling. I returned to bed, though it took me a long time to fall back asleep. The next day, I avoided the door. I tried to focus on other things, reading, hiking, cooking, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling it gave me. Every time I passed by it, I felt as though I was being watched. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder. I turned off the fire and stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The knocking stopped, but then I heard something else, a faint whisper, too soft to make out the words. I backed away, my hands trembling. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had been trapped in the basement. Maybe they needed help. But that didn't make sense. The lock was rusted shut, and no one could have been down there for years. As I stood there, frozen with indecision, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It sounded like multiple voices now, overlapping and echoing in the small cabin. Against every instinct, I approached the door. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath came out in white puffs. I placed my hand on the padlock, and the whispering stopped. Then a voice, clear and close, spoke directly into my ear. "Let me out," I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, but I didn't dare move. My heart thundered in my chest as I fumbled to pick up the flashlight. When I finally turned it back on, the cabin was silent again. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I was determined to leave. I packed my bags, but something held me back. As much as I wanted to get away, I felt a strange pull to the cabin, to the door. It was as though something, or someone, was compelling me to stay. By evening, I found myself standing in front of the locked door again, the flashlight in one hand and a hammer in the other. "Just look," I whispered to myself. "Just see what's inside." It took several hard swings to break the padlock. Each strike echoed through the cabin, making me jump. When the lock finally fell away, I hesitated. Slowly, I pulled the door open. A set of wooden stairs led down into darkness. The air that rose from the basement was damp and cold, carrying a faint, sour smell. I shone the flashlight down the stairs. The beam illuminated stone walls and a dirt floor, but nothing else. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and the chill grew more intense the further I went. When I reached the bottom, I swept the flashlight around the room. It was empty. The walls were lined with shelves, but they were bare. The only thing in the room was a small wooden chair in the center, its legs scratched and worn. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The dirt floor wasn't solid. It had been disturbed, as though someone had been digging. I crouched down, running my hand over the loose soil. It felt soft, freshly turned. My mind raced. What had been buried here? Or worse, what had been dug up? I suddenly felt a presence behind me, cold and oppressive. Spinning around, I saw nothing, but the air felt heavier, thicker. Then I heard it, the voice again, but this time it was coming from all around me. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. That night, I stayed awake, sitting by the fireplace with every light in the cabin on. The whispers started again, louder than ever. They surrounded me, filling the room, growing angrier and more insistent. The cabin felt alive, as though it was closing in on me. Shadows danced on the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the flickering firelight. When the whispers suddenly stopped, the silence was even worse. And then the knocking began again, this time from the front door. Terrified, I grabbed my bags and ran out of the cabin into the dark forest. I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was dark, its windows empty and lifeless. But just as it disappeared from view, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I've never gone back to that cabin, but sometimes I dream about it. In the dreams, I'm standing in front of the locked basement door, and the voices are louder than ever. And every time, I wake up to the sound of knocking. When I first saw the cabin, it seemed like the perfect getaway. The listing online described it as cozy and peaceful, surrounded by a dense forest with no neighbors for miles. Exactly what I needed to clear my head. Life in the city had been overwhelming, and I wanted nothing more than a quiet weekend to myself. The cabin was old but charming, with weathered wood and a stone chimney. Inside, it had a warm, rustic feel, worn wooden floors, a small fireplace, and a large window overlooking the trees. It was almost too perfect. After unpacking my bag, I explored the cabin. There wasn't much to see, just a small living room, a kitchenette, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed. Everything felt old, as if it hadn't been updated in decades. But that only added to its charm. On the coffee table, I noticed a photo album. It was old and dusty, the leather cover cracked with age. Curious, I picked it up and sat down on the couch to flip through it. The first few pages were filled with happy family photos. A man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. They looked so cheerful, posing in front of the cabin, hiking in the woods, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. But as I kept turning the pages, something changed. The family's smiles looked forced, their eyes hollow. The photos became darker, the backgrounds shadowy and blurred. In one picture, the children were standing by the cabin's window, staring outside with frightened expressions. I closed the album, suddenly uneasy. It was just an old photo album, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. But a chill crept over me as I put it back on the coffee table. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, and the forest outside was eerily quiet. I had expected to hear crickets or the rustling of leaves, but there was nothing. Just silence. Around midnight, I thought I heard a sound, soft, like footsteps on the wooden floor. I sat up, heart racing. "Hello." I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, but the air in the room felt heavier, colder. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was still thinking about those strange photos. I lay back down, pulling the blanket tightly around me. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, but tried to shake it off. I made some coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the forest. The sun was shining, and everything looked calm and peaceful. But when I glanced at the coffee table, I froze. The photo album was open. I was sure I had closed it the night before, but now it lay open to a page I hadn't seen before. The photo showed the family sitting around the fireplace, but something was off. Their faces were blurred, almost smudged, and their eyes were completely black. I shut the album quickly and decided to go for a walk. I needed to clear my head. The forest was quiet and beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. When I got back to the cabin, I was relieved to be inside again, but the uneasiness didn't go away. That evening, I decided to look through the album again. I told myself it was just an old book, nothing to be afraid of. Maybe there was some logical explanation for the strange photos. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something chilling. The photos were changing. The happy family photos were gone. Now, every picture showed the family standing inside the cabin, staring straight at the camera with blank, expressionless faces. In one photo, the father was pointing at the window. I turned the page, my hands trembling. The next photo made me gasp. It was a picture of the living room, the same room I was sitting in. Everything in the photo looked exactly as it did now, except for one detail. In the photo, someone was standing in the corner of the room. A dark figure, too blurry to make out, but clearly there. I slammed the album shut, my heart pounding. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the photos. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, maybe some kind of old photo effect that made them look strange. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, they were louder, heavier. They were coming from the living room. I sat up, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped, but then I heard another sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of a child giggling. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the bedroom door. My hands were shaking as I opened it, shining the light into the living room. It was empty, but the photo album was open again, lying on the floor in front of the couch. I approached it slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The album was open to a new photo. It was a picture of me, standing in the bedroom doorway, holding the flashlight. I dropped the album and ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door shut. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight and staring at the door. Every now and then, I thought I heard whispers, but I told myself it was just the wind. When morning finally came, I decided to leave. I couldn't stay in the cabin another night. But when I stepped into the living room, I froze. The photo album was gone. I looked everywhere, but it had completely disappeared. The coffee table was empty, and there was no sign of it anywhere in the cabin. I packed my things as quickly as I could and headed for the door. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, the sound of a camera shutter. Turning slowly, I saw the photo album sitting on the couch. It was open to a new page, and I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The photo showed the cabin, but it was empty. There was no furniture, no signs of life. Just an empty, dark room. I grabbed my bags and ran out of the cabin, not stopping until I was in my car and driving away. Even now, I can't explain what happened in that cabin. I try to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. Sometimes late at night, I hear the sound of a camera clicking, and when I look in the mirror, I swear I see someone standing behind me, smiling. It all started when my best friend, Mark, found the cabin online. He was always finding strange places for us to explore, but this one seemed different. The pictures showed a rundown wooden cabin, deep in the forest, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out the sun. "It's perfect for the weekend," Mark said with his usual excitement. "No cell service, no distractions, just us and the great outdoors." I wasn't so sure. The cabin looked eerie, even in the daylight photos, but Mark's enthusiasm was hard to resist. So I agreed, and a few days later, we packed up our gear and drove deep into the woods. When we arrived, the cabin looked worse than it had in the pictures. The wood was rotting in places, and the windows were so grimy you could barely see through them. The air smelled damp, and the forest around the cabin was deathly quiet. "Rustic charm," Mark said with a grin, pushing the door open. The inside wasn't much better. The furniture was old and covered in dust. The wooden floor creaked with every step, and the walls were lined with dark, faded wallpaper that seemed to ripple in the dim light. But what caught my attention was the shadows. Even with the sunlight streaming through the windows, the shadows in the cabin seemed darker than they should have been. They clung to the corners of the room, shifting slightly when you weren't looking directly at them. "Creepy," I muttered under my breath. "What?" Mark asked, dumping his bag on the couch. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just, it's quiet out here." That first night, Mark and I sat around the small fireplace, eating canned food and telling stories. The forest outside was pitch black, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. As the night wore on, Mark started talking about the cabin's history. "They say it's been abandoned for decades," he said, his voice low. "No one knows who built it or why they left. But people claim they've seen strange things here, shadows moving on their own, strange noises, that sort of thing." I rolled my eyes. "You're just trying to freak me out." Mark laughed. "Maybe. Or maybe it's true." I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, almost alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I still found it hard to relax. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Mark. He had a habit of wandering around at night when he couldn't sleep. But as I listened, I realized the footsteps didn't sound normal. They were slow, deliberate, and heavier than Mark's. "Mark," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for him to respond, but there was only silence. Grabbing my flashlight, I climbed out of bed and crept into the living room. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to shift as I moved the light around. "Mark," I called out again. I found him asleep on the couch, snoring softly. The footsteps hadn't been his. Suddenly, the floorboards behind me creaked. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the corner of the room. The shadows there seemed darker, deeper, as if they were reaching out toward me. My heart pounded as I backed away, bumping into the couch. Mark stirred, groaning softly. "What's going on?" he muttered, sitting up. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Hear what?" "Footsteps." Mark frowned, rubbing his eyes. "You're just spooking yourself. Go back to bed." I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next day, Mark decided to go hiking. I stayed behind, still uneasy after the night before. The cabin felt strange during the day, quiet and still, but not in a peaceful way. I spent the morning cleaning up and trying to distract myself. But no matter where I went in the cabin, I felt like I wasn't alone. At one point, I noticed something odd. The shadows on the walls didn't match the light coming in from the windows. They were angled wrong, stretching in directions they shouldn't have been. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it, when one of the shadows moved. It wasn't subtle, it slid across the wall, independent of the light. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. "Mark," I called out, even though I knew he wasn't back yet. The shadow froze, then slowly crept into the corner of the room, merging with the other shadows. I grabbed my jacket and ran outside, desperate to escape the suffocating feeling of the cabin. Mark returned in the afternoon, cheerful and completely oblivious to my growing fear. I told him what I'd seen, but he just laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies," he said. "I'm serious," I insisted. "There's something wrong with this place." "All right," he said, holding up his hands. "If it'll make you feel better, we'll leave tomorrow." That night, I felt a little calmer, knowing we'd be leaving soon. But as the hours passed, the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were louder, heavier, and they didn't stop. They moved through the cabin, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was searching for something. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the bedroom door, my heart pounding. The living room was empty, but the shadows were everywhere. They writhed and shifted, growing larger, spreading across the walls and floor. "Mark," I shouted, running to the couch. But he wasn't there. Panic set in as I searched the cabin, but he was nowhere to be found. The shadows seemed to close in around me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, trapping me inside. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows began to take shape, twisting into figures with hollow eyes and outstretched hands. I screamed, backing into a corner as the shadows closed in. When I woke up, the cabin was silent. The shadows were gone, and the front door was wide open. Mark was standing outside, staring into the forest. "Mark," I called out, my voice weak. He turned to look at me, but his eyes were empty, his face expressionless. Without saying a word, he walked into the woods and disappeared among the trees. I didn't follow him. Instead, I grabbed my things and ran to the car, driving away as fast as I could. I don't know what happened in that cabin, but I still have nightmares about it. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I see shadows moving in the corners of my room. And when I call out for Mark, I swear I hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. My girlfriend, Claire, and I had booked a secluded cabin deep in the mountains for a romantic weekend away. Life had been stressful lately, and the idea of being surrounded by nature with no distractions seemed like exactly what we needed. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding, the road cutting through dense forests that seemed untouched by time. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace and large windows that overlooked the forest. It felt like a place out of a storybook, isolated, peaceful, and perfect. "I love it," Claire said, spinning around in the living room. "It's like something out of a dream." I smiled, glad she was happy. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, like we were being watched. I told myself it was just the eerie quiet of the forest. That first night, everything seemed fine. We cooked dinner together, laughed, and talked about anything and everything. The fireplace crackled warmly, filling the cabin with a soft glow. But as the night went on, the atmosphere began to change. It started with little things, a creak in the floorboards, the faint sound of something tapping against the window. At first, I ignored it, but the sounds became harder to dismiss. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. The tapping had turned into a faint scratching, like nails dragging against wood. "It's probably just a tree branch," I said, trying to sound calm. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. No branches, no animals. Just darkness. We decided to go to bed early, hoping the unsettling noises were just part of staying in an old cabin. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, the sound of footsteps, or a creak in the hallway. Claire shifted beside me. "Did you lock the front door?" she asked. "I did," I said, but her question made me uneasy. I got up to check, just to be sure. The door was locked, but as I turned to go back to the bedroom, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the living room. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but the shadow disappeared into the corner of the room, where the light from the fireplace didn't reach. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I told Claire about what I had seen. She looked worried, but tried to reassure me. "Maybe it was just the firelight playing tricks on you," she said. "Maybe," I replied, though I didn't believe it. We spent the day hiking, trying to enjoy the beauty of the forest. But even in the sunlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed to press in around us, their branches like outstretched arms. At one point, Claire stopped suddenly, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened, but all I could hear was the rustling of leaves. "It sounded like someone calling my name," she said. I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "It's probably just the wind." But Claire didn't look convinced. When we returned to the cabin, the uneasy feeling had only grown stronger. The air inside felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been. We decided to play a board game to distract ourselves. For a while it worked. We laughed and joked, and the strange feelings began to fade. But then, the lights flickered. At first, it was just a brief dimming, but then they went out completely, leaving us in darkness. "Great," Claire said, pulling out her phone to use as a flashlight. "Do you think it's the power?" "Probably," I said, though I wasn't so sure. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and went to check the breaker box. As I opened it, I noticed something strange. The switches hadn't been tripped. Everything was in place. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the empty kitchen. When I returned to the living room, Claire was sitting on the couch, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked. She pointed to the window. "I saw something," she whispered. It was standing right there, watching me. I looked outside, but there was nothing but trees and darkness. "It's okay," I said, trying to comfort her. Maybe it was just a deer or something, but I could tell she didn't believe me. That night was worse than the first. The strange noises didn't stop, scratching, tapping, and faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. At one point, I woke up to find Claire sitting up in bed, staring at the door. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. I listened and heard it too, a faint shuffling sound, like someone walking barefoot across the wooden floor. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the bedroom door. The living room was empty, but the front door was wide open. "Did you leave the door open?" I asked Claire. "No," she said, her voice shaking. I closed and locked the door, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. The next morning, we decided to leave. The trip wasn't worth it anymore, and neither of us felt safe. As we packed our bags, I noticed something strange on the wall. There were scratches, long, deep gouges in the wood, like claw marks. "Did you see these before?" I asked Claire. She shook her head, her face pale. We didn't say much as we loaded the car and started the drive back down the mountain. But even as we left the cabin behind, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. A week later, Claire called me in the middle of the night, her voice trembling. I think it followed us," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I see shadows in my apartment," she whispered. "And I hear noises at night. It's like it's still with me." I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, but the truth was I had experienced the same thing. Even now, I see shadows moving in the corners of my room, and I hear faint whispers when I'm alone. Whatever was in that cabin didn't stay there. It came home with us, and no matter where we go, we can't escape it. There was a trail in Pennsylvania that I walked many times over the years, winding through thick woods, past rocky streams, up and down rolling hills. Part of the trail crossed through private land, where an old, weathered cabin stood among the trees. The owner was never around, or so I thought. The first time I saw him was on a late summer afternoon. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. As I stepped into the clearing near the cabin, I noticed a man sitting on the porch. He was big, with a thick beard and rough-looking clothes. Empty beer cans surrounded him. He looked at me with dull, glassy eyes. "Keep it moving," he said. His voice was deep, gruff. "Ain't no food here." I hadn't asked for food. I hadn't said anything at all. His words felt strange, almost like a warning. I nodded, kept my head down, and hurried past, feeling the weight of his gaze on my back long after I left the clearing. A year passed before I returned. This time, I wasn't alone. My sister, my wife, and her friend were with me. We planned a weekend hike, camping along the trail. I had told them about the cabin, about the man I saw, but they laughed it off. "Just a grumpy old guy," my sister said. "Probably didn't want hikers near his place." The first day of hiking was peaceful. We walked through the towering trees, listening to birds calling high above. Sunlight filtered through the branches, making patterns on the ground. We stopped to eat lunch by a small creek, dipping our feet in the cold water. By late afternoon, we reached the stretch of trail that passed through the cabin's yard. This time, the man was there again. He was standing over a grill, smoke curling into the air. A pile of empty beer cans sat near his feet. When he saw us, his face split into a wide, yellow-toothed grin. "Well, well," he said. His eyes flicked over the women in our group. "Y'all out here for the night?" I hesitated, then nodded. "We're camping a little ways up the trail." "You ought to stay here," he said, motioning to the cabin. "Got plenty of space. And I got food on the grill." My wife shook her head politely. "Thank you, but we already have a spot in mind." His smile faded just a little. "Ain't no trouble. I don't mind guests." Something about his voice made my skin crawl. He was insisting too much. His eyes lingered on my wife and her friend in a way that made me uncomfortable. "We should get going," I said, stepping forward slightly, positioning myself between him and the group. His face twitched. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning back to the grill. We walked quickly away, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't say anything until we were well out of earshot. "That guy creeps me out," I said. "You think he would have tried something?" my sister asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't want to find out." We reached our campsite just before dusk. It was a quiet clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a small fire pit in the center. We set up our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked a simple meal. The tension from earlier began to fade as we laughed and talked, watching the flames dance in the darkness. Night settled over the woods. The air grew colder. An owl hooted in the distance. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the trees. Then I heard it, a faint rustling. I held up a hand, signaling for silence. The others stopped talking. The rustling came again, somewhere beyond the trees. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer. Maybe a raccoon. Then came the sound of a footstep. Not an animal. A person. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness. The firelight didn't reach far, but I thought I saw movement. A shadow shifting between the trees. I stood up. "Who's there?" I called. Silence. Then a soft chuckle. Low. Muffled. My stomach twisted. I knew that laugh. The man from the cabin. My wife grabbed my arm. "We should go," she whispered. I nodded. We hurried to put out the fire, packing what little we could in the dark. We didn't bother with the tents. We just needed to get out of there. Then came another sound. A shuffling, closer this time. A muttered voice. I caught a few words. "See what they got." Just a look. Panic surged through me. I fumbled in my pack, searching for something, anything. My hand closed around the air horn I always carried. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The sound was deafening, echoing through the trees, splitting the night apart. A startled yelp. The crunch of leaves as someone stumbled backward. Then silence. We didn't wait. We ran. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs ached. We ran down the trail, through the dark woods, not stopping until we saw the distant glow of a road. Only then did we pause, gasping for breath. The man never followed. Or if he did, we never saw him. The next day, we returned with park rangers. Our campsite was empty, but footprints circled where our tents had been. Beer cans littered the ground. The rangers knew the man. They said he was a local who lived alone in the woods. "He's mostly harmless," one of them said. I wasn't so sure. We never went back to that trail again. There is something about winter in the woods that feels different from any other time of year. The silence is deeper, the cold sharper, and the world feels empty, like you are the only person left on Earth. I had always loved that feeling. That's why one winter, my friends and I decided to rent a remote cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just a few days away from the world, away from work, stress, and everything else. The cabin was old but solid. It sat in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees. A thick layer of snow covered the ground, and more was falling from the sky in soft, quiet flakes. There was no cell service, no electricity except for a small generator, and no neighbors for miles. It was perfect. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend James, and a couple we knew, Sarah and Mark. We had packed enough food and supplies to last for the weekend, planning to spend our time playing cards, drinking, and enjoying the quiet. The first night was calm. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and talked late into the night. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the walls of the cabin creak. But inside, it was warm and safe. We had no idea what was waiting for us. The next morning, we woke up to a blizzard. The snow was falling heavily now, thick and fast, covering everything in sight. The wind had picked up, howling like an angry animal. Mark checked his phone, frowning. "No signal," he said. "Guess we're stuck here for now." "We planned to stay anyway," Sarah said with a shrug. "What's the big deal?" James nodded. "Yeah, we have enough food. It's just snow." At first, it was fun. We spent the day playing games, making jokes, and watching the storm through the windows. It felt like we were in a little world of our own, cut off from everything else. But then, as the day turned to night, things started to feel different. The storm got worse. The wind slammed against the cabin, shaking the walls. The snow piled up so high outside that we could barely see out the windows. And then the power went out. The generator died suddenly, leaving us in complete darkness. "Great," Mark muttered. "Now what?" James lit a few candles, their small flames flickering in the cold air. "We have flashlights," he said. "And the fireplace. We'll be fine." But something about the darkness felt wrong. It pressed in around us, thick and heavy, as if the cabin was sinking into it. And then, in the middle of the night, we heard the first sound. It was faint at first. A soft crunching noise, like footsteps in the snow. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I held my breath, listening. Maybe it was just the wind, or an animal. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. Crunch. Crunch. Someone, or something, was outside. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, pointing it toward the window. The glass was frosted over, but I could just barely make out the shape of a person standing at the edge of the trees. A woman. She was barefoot, wearing only a thin nightgown, her dark hair wild and tangled. She wasn't moving, just standing there in the snow, staring at the cabin. A chill ran down my spine. I scrambled out of bed and shook James awake. "James," I whispered. "There's someone outside." He groaned, sitting up. "What?" I pointed at the window. "Look." James grabbed his own flashlight and shone it outside. But when we looked again, she was gone. My stomach twisted. "You saw her, right?" James nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "But where did she go?" We woke up Sarah and Mark and told them what we saw. Mark frowned. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just a shadow." "I know what I saw," I said firmly. "She was there." Sarah bit her lip. "But why would a woman be out here in a blizzard? She'd freeze to death." No one had an answer for that. We didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise made us jump. The storm outside raged on, the wind screaming like a wounded animal. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the world outside was eerily quiet. We decided to go outside and look for tracks, just to prove to ourselves that we weren't imagining things. We stepped out into the cold, our boots sinking into the deep snow. And then we saw them. Footprints, leading from the trees to the cabin, but not away. Where did she go? Sarah whispered. There's no trail leading back. We followed the prints, our breath fogging in the cold air. The tracks led us toward the edge of the woods, where a large snowdrift had formed against the trees. That's when we saw the clothes. A thin nightgown, half buried in the snow, and a little farther ahead a hand, frozen and pale, sticking up from the snow like it was reaching for something. Sarah screamed. Mark pulled her away as James and I stepped closer, our stomachs turning. It was the woman. She had no shoes, no coat, nothing to protect her from the cold. Her skin was blue, her dark eyes frozen open in terror. She had been dead for hours. My mind raced. How had she gotten here? Who was she? And if she was dead, then what had we seen last night? We hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind us. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, James broke the silence. We need to call the police. There's no signal, Mark said. We'd have to hike back to the main road. In this snow. Sarah shook her head. It's too deep. We'd never make it. We had no choice but to wait. As the day dragged on, an uneasy feeling settled over us. The woman's frozen face haunted my thoughts. She had been scared. Whatever happened to her, she had been running from something. That night, we took turns keeping watch. No one wanted to sleep. And then, just past midnight, we heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps in the snow. I gripped my flashlight tightly, heart pounding. It's not possible, I whispered. Sarah whimpered. She's dead. We saw her. But the footsteps kept coming. Closer, closer. And then a soft knock on the door. Tap, tap, tap. We all froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Then came the voice. Faint, whispering. Let me in. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move. I didn't speak. The whisper came again, right outside the door. Please, I'm cold. Sarah sobbed into her hands. Mark gripped the fire poker like a weapon. I wanted to open the door, to prove to myself that nothing was there. But I couldn't. I was too afraid. We stayed like that all night, too scared to move. By morning, the sound was gone. When we finally opened the door, there were no footprints in the snow signs that anyone had been there. We left that day, hiking through the deep snow until we reached the main road. We called the police, told them about the body. They found her later that day. A missing woman. She had wandered away from another cabin during the storm, lost and confused, and froze to death in the cold. But I know what I saw, and I still don't understand how she knocked on our door after she was already dead. Winter in the woods always felt different from anywhere else. It was quieter, heavier. The weight of the snow on the trees, the absence of birdsong, the way the wind cut through everything, it made the world feel smaller, emptier. I had spent years hiking through forests in every season, but winter always unsettled me the most. That's probably why I hesitated when my friend offered me his family's remote cabin for a weekend. He had inherited it from his grandfather, an old, isolated place deep in the mountains of Montana. The kind of place with no neighbors, no cell signal, no power aside from a small generator. The kind of place you went to disappear for a while. I had needed that. Life had been wearing me down. Work, stress, the endless noise of the city. The thought of being alone for a weekend, completely off the grid, sounded perfect. I packed my truck with supplies, food, water, firewood, extra blankets, my rifle in case of wildlife, and set off early in the morning before the next snowstorm rolled in. The drive was long, winding through narrow, unmaintained roads. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the snow thickened, the trees pressing in from both sides. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. I followed the narrow path until I spotted the cabin through the trees. It was exactly as I expected, small, simple, made of dark, weathered wood. Snow covered the roof in thick piles, icicles hanging from the eaves. The windows were dark, the porch half buried in snowdrifts. The place looked untouched, as if it had been waiting for me. I parked beside the cabin, the tires of my truck crunching through the frozen ground. The silence was immediate. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the muffled sound of my own breath in the cold air. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside, my boots heavy on the old wooden floor. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of dust and aged timber. I turned on the generator, the low hum breaking the silence. A single overhead bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the room. It was a simple space. A small kitchen with a rusted stove. A stone fireplace, stacked with neatly cut firewood. A single bed with an old wool blanket. A rocking chair by the window. It felt frozen in time, like no one had set foot inside for years. I set up my things, started a fire, and made coffee. Outside, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the trees, the shadows stretching long and thin. I stood at the window, sipping from my mug, watching the snow swirl through the trees. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the tree line. A girl, dressed in white, her figure barely visible against the snow. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. I set my mug down slowly, my heartbeat picking up. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The way the wind moved through the trees, the shifting light of the setting sun, it could have been anything. But then she took a step forward. Her feet were bare. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. She was too far away for me to see her face clearly, but something about her posture, the way she stood, made my stomach tighten. She was too still, too quiet. I turned away from the window, rubbing my arms. It had to be a mistake. Maybe someone from another cabin nearby, though I knew there weren't any for miles. Maybe she was lost. I looked back. She was gone. I stared for a long time, my pulse still hammering. It was probably nothing. That's what I told myself. The wind picked up again after dark. It howled through the trees, making the cabin creak in protest. The fire crackled in the fireplace, sending flickering light across the wooden walls. I sat at the small table, eating a simple meal, canned soup, crackers, hot tea. Outside, the snow was still falling. The wind blew it into strange patterns, swirling shapes that danced in the moonlight. I tried not to think about the girl. But as the night deepened, an unease settled in my stomach. I found myself glancing toward the window more often than I wanted to, checking the shadows outside, the dark gaps between the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I still locked the door. I banked the fire, crawled into bed, and pulled the blankets up tight. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around me, comforting in the dark. I closed my eyes, and then I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps outside. I stopped breathing. The wind still howled, rattling the windows. But underneath it, I could hear something else. The unmistakable crunch of snow, slow and deliberate. I lay still, my body rigid. The footsteps moved closer. My throat tightened. I forced myself to sit up, every nerve in my body screaming. The sound stopped. Silence. The wind outside surged again, drowning out everything else. I listened, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. I lay back down, but I didn't sleep. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was white and still, untouched. The air was cold, crisp in my lungs as I stepped onto the porch. The snow had drifted high against the trees, erasing most of the tracks from the night before. Most. Not all. I saw them near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. Small. Barefoot. Leading from the trees toward the cabin, but none leading away. I felt my stomach drop. The girl. I followed the tracks slowly, my breath clouding in the morning air. The prints were shallow, delicate. They stopped just a few feet from the cabin, right outside my window. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. No prints leading back. No sign of where she had gone. Just the cold, empty snow. I turned back toward the cabin, forcing myself to stay calm. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. I had two choices: leave, or stay and figure out what was happening. I chose to stay. The day passed in a slow, uneasy haze. I tried to distract myself, chopping wood, reading by the fire, drinking cup after cup of coffee. But my thoughts kept circling back to the tracks. To the girl. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had she disappeared without leaving a trail? I watched the woods as the sun began to set, the light fading into deep blue shadows. The air grew colder, pressing against the walls of the cabin. I forced myself to eat dinner, though I barely tasted it. Night fell, and then the knocking started. Soft, slow, just outside the door. I froze, my fork clattering against the plate. The fire crackled behind me, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. I turned my head toward the door. The knocking came again. Tap, tap. I stood, my pulse hammering in my throat. The wind groaned outside, rattling the wooden walls. But beneath it, I could hear something else. A faint, whispering breath. Right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The fire snapped loudly, sending a burst of sparks up the chimney. And then, silence. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring at the door. Then slowly, I stepped forward and unlatched it. I pulled it open. Snow swirled in the doorway. But there was nothing there, just the endless, empty woods, and the single set of footprints leading up to my door. I left the next morning. I didn't pack, didn't clean up, just grabbed my keys, started the truck, and drove without looking back. I never told my friend what happened. But weeks later, I looked up the area, searching through old news archives. And I found something. 30 years ago, a missing girl, lost in a snowstorm near the cabin. Her body was never found, only her footprints in the snow. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe I just wanted to be alone for a while. Maybe I thought a weekend away from the noise of the city would clear my head. Maybe I was just tired of everything. The drive up had been long. 3 hours of winding roads, trees stretching endlessly on either side. The cabin was isolated, exactly as advertised. No neighbors, no streetlights, just a dirt path leading to a small clearing. The trees were so dense that even during the day, the place felt dim. I parked my car, stepping out into the crisp air. The sky was pale gray, the kind that signaled snow might come soon. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. A simple wooden structure with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were small, making it look darker inside than it probably was. I grabbed my bag from the car, locking it behind me out of habit, even though I doubted anyone else was around for miles. Inside, the air was stale. It smelled like wood and dust. The furniture was basic, just a couch, a small table, a chair, and a fireplace with a neat stack of logs beside it. The kitchen was small, with an old gas stove and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The fridge was empty, just as I expected, so I put away the groceries I had brought. The bedroom was just as simple. A bed with a thick, scratchy-looking blanket, a nightstand, and a dresser. There was a single window, showing nothing but trees. I dropped my bag on the bed and took a deep breath. The quiet was overwhelming. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I tried to settle in. I lit the fireplace, made myself something to eat, and sat in the chair, staring at the flames. The heat felt good. Outside, the wind was picking up, making the trees sway. I checked my phone, no service, just like I expected. I had brought some books, but I wasn't in the mood to read. Instead, I just sat there, listening to the fire crackle. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the fire had burned low, just glowing embers. The room was cold. I stood up, stretching, my muscles stiff. The cabin was silent. Too silent. I didn't hear the wind anymore. I didn't hear anything at all. I walked to the window. The trees were still. The sky was dark, no stars, no moon. Just blackness pressing in from all sides. I had that strange feeling, the kind that creeps up on you when you wake up in the middle of the night and feel like something isn't right. I turned away, rubbing my arms for warmth. I added more wood to the fire, watching as the flames caught, flickering higher. The warmth returned, but the feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it slowly. My ears strained for any sound. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I shifted my weight. Then I heard it, a soft sound, from outside. It was distant, barely noticeable at first. A rustling, like something moving through the leaves. My body went still. I held my breath. It could have been an animal. Probably was. Deer were common in these parts. Maybe a raccoon. But something about the sound made my skin prickle. I stepped closer to the window. The darkness outside felt thicker, like it was pushing against the glass. I couldn't see anything. No movement. No shapes. Just black. Then it happened again. A rustling. Closer this time. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I forced myself to turn away from the window, walking back to the fireplace. I sat down, staring at the flames, trying to ignore the way my stomach felt tight. But then there was a thump. A single, heavy thump against the side of the cabin. I shot up from my seat. My heart was pounding. I waited. Listened. Nothing. Just when I started convincing myself I imagined it, there was another one. Thump. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate. Too steady. I moved slowly to the window again. My breath felt too loud. I squinted into the darkness. Nothing. Then movement. Just barely. A shift in the shadows. A shape. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was someone out there, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen. Then they moved. Not towards the cabin. Not away. Just shifting, barely visible. I stepped away from the window, my hands shaking. I reached for my phone, knowing already there was no service. Thump. I almost dropped it. The sound was right against the wall now. Whoever they weren't leaving. I ran through my options. My car was outside, but I would have to go out there to get to it. I didn't know how many of them there were. I grabbed the fire poker, gripping it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't move. I stood near the fireplace, the poker in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees. And then, just like that, the thumping stopped. I waited, listened. Nothing. I forced myself to move, inching toward the window. My fingers trembled as I pulled the curtain back, just a little. The figure was gone. The trees stood silent. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until the sun started to rise, my eyes never leaving the window. When it was light enough, I grabbed my bag, my keys, and bolted for my car. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. I don't know who, or what, was out there that night. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back. I should have picked a different place. Maybe a hotel. Maybe a cabin closer to town. Something with neighbors, streetlights, maybe even a front desk where someone would notice if we didn't come back. But I wanted privacy. I wanted something quiet, peaceful. Just me and Lisa, away from work, away from our phones, away from the constant distractions of life. A weekend in the woods sounded perfect. The cabin was an Airbnb, cheap, isolated, a little old but well-reviewed. The pictures looked nice. A cozy log cabin with a fireplace, a big wooden deck, a fire pit outside. The kind of place you see in movies where couples drink wine and cuddle under blankets. It was deep in the woods, about 45 minutes from the nearest town. I figured it would be a perfect getaway. The drive up was long, twisting roads that seemed to get narrower the further we went. Tall trees lined both sides, blocking out most of the sky. The last stretch wasn't even paved, just a dirt road with tire tracks, cutting through thick woods. When we pulled up, I felt a little uneasy. The place looked exactly like the pictures, but something about seeing it in person made it feel smaller. The trees pressed in close, the windows dark. The silence was heavy, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound you make. Lisa was excited. She loved the idea of being away from everything. We unpacked, settled in. The inside was nice, wooden walls, a fireplace, a small but well-stocked kitchen. There was even an old radio on a shelf, the kind with dials instead of buttons. The bedroom was small but cozy, a big bed with thick blankets. The first night was good. We made dinner, had some wine, sat by the fire. It felt nice, peaceful. The air outside was crisp, cold enough that the fire felt extra warm. We left the windows cracked just a little, letting in fresh air. I remember lying in bed, listening to the faint rustling of leaves outside, feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. Then around 2 a.m., I woke up. It took me a second to figure out why. The fire was still glowing faintly, casting soft orange light across the room. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The wind had stopped. The leaves weren't rustling anymore. Then I heard it. A sound from outside. It wasn't loud. Just a soft crunch, like a footstep on dead leaves. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Lisa. My heart was pounding a little, but I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. Or a raccoon. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. A deliberate step. I swung my legs over the bed, moving carefully. The floor creaked under my weight. I stepped to the window, peering out. Darkness. Just trees. Shadows stretching between them. I stayed there for a while, listening. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe the wind had started again, moving the leaves in a way that sounded like footsteps. Eventually, I went back to bed. It took a while to fall asleep, but I convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some firewood. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. They weren't ours. They were fresh, deep, not animal tracks, boots. Someone had walked up to the cabin in the middle of the night, and then turned back. I stood there, staring at them. The prints stopped about 10 feet from the cabin, then went back the way they came. Whoever it was hadn't knocked, hadn't tried the door, just walked up, stood there, and left. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I didn't wake Lisa. I didn't want to scare her. Instead, I grabbed a piece of firewood and walked around the cabin, checking for anything else. No broken windows. No signs of forced entry. Just those footprints. Maybe it was a hiker. Someone lost, seeing the cabin, and deciding not to bother us. Maybe it was the owner checking in on the place. I told myself that, but I didn't really believe it. Still, I didn't say anything. We had breakfast, went for a short walk, spent the day lounging around. The thought stayed in the back of my mind, but nothing else happened. That night, I made sure the doors were locked. The wind had picked up again, making the trees creak. Lisa fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every small noise. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. A footstep. Then another. Slow. Careful. I sat up, heart hammering. The fire was still burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I turned my head toward the window, and I saw him. A man, standing just beyond the tree line. Not moving, not hiding, just standing there, watching. My body went cold. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, his face just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking at me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then slowly he stepped back and disappeared into the trees. I sat there for a long time, gripping the blankets, my mind racing. Who the hell was he? What did he want? I didn't wake Lisa. I didn't want to scare her. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I went outside. The footprints were there again. Closer this time. I woke Lisa, told her we were leaving. I didn't explain why, just said I didn't feel comfortable staying. She was confused, a little annoyed, but she didn't argue. We packed quickly. I kept looking at the tree line, expecting to see him again. As we drove away, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The further we got from the cabin, the better I felt. I never told Lisa what I saw. I didn't want her to have that image in her head. But I know what I saw. And I know, without a doubt, that he wasn't just some lost hiker. He was waiting, watching. And if we had stayed another night, I don't think he would have just stood there.